interview series on anti-imperialist America. I am very honored to have with me a very special guest that I've known for years and have a lot of respect for, Brother Carlos Caban, revolutionary working class historian. How are you tonight, brother?
I think I'm trying. Oh, there we go. Okay. Todo bien. Yeah, it's really good because we've talked a few times over the years, por teléfono, but now we finally got this whole whatever you call this live thing. Like I said, I'm still getting used to this, but I like it. Yeah, it's like this is kind of cool. The last time I've done an internet interview was someone like this was years ago. It was like a podcast or whatever with a local. I don't know what he was like a libertarian, but he would interview local rappers, local poets, local whatever politicians. He was very free minded, but he had me on there. He was like, just say what you got. He's like, I like your poetry, and it went from there. And it was actually the highest rated of all of his programs, which was kind of cool. But yeah, everything's I guess good right now. I know they couldn't tell because we were talking before we say we're live. We were just discussing, a little bit of Southeast Asia and what's going on. And there's just something I might have told you. It's just kind of funny to me because you know as well as I do, a lot of the Vietnamese Americans tend to be, or at least the first wave or so, tend to be more conservative. Not as necessary. But there's one woman I work with, and I don't like guessing people ages away. I'm horrible at that. But I'm gonna say she's probably in her 40s, and she's straight from Vietnam. And she's a really cool person, and she can make pupusas because her ex-novio can make them. But here's the funny thing. Me being nosy and always asking people what they think about different leaders, I'm like, so I know the answer is going to be, like, what do you think of Ho Chi Minh? And I already knew she'd probably be like, I'm saying some stuff, but she's like, oh, I love that man. He was a great man. I'm like, wait, what? I wasn't expecting that. Only because, a lot of the population, but it was kind of cool. We had an interesting conversation about Vietnam, but I just thought it was hilarious that her ex boyfriend was, Wanaco from El Salvador, because their pupusas are amazing, and she wants to make me some. But our people, I'm Hondureño, Catracho, Hondurans and Salvadorans always argue who makes the best pupusas. And I'm like, I don't care. I love them all. Why argue?
Pupusas are good, man.
Yeah. Did you ever hear about? This is something that actually kind of like. I've met people who fought in the war, the so-called, guerra de fútbol, the soccer war between the two countries. Now, I've met people when I lived in Honduras who actively participated in it. They were high-ranking officers in the Honduran army, armed forces. And what bothers me the most about that is not even people thinking it was literally a war over, football, even though there was a football match, un partido, or whatever, un portada, we say it. But the craziest thing was, when I started doing research on it, it's not just that even though I'm Honduran, I'm mixed culturally, but the reason why I said I'm not really nationalistic in the sense that I'm not gonna hate someone from El Salvador, because I'll say what happened was a lot of it was Honduran, not Honduran. Excuse me, I keep burping. The Honduran government's fault at the time, which was the military regime supported by the United States and all that shit, but. It's like they literally remember actually have how what is it called, when the Hutus and the Tutsis were going after each other, and of course that's another colonial division. But when the Hutus the Tutsis would go out, the Hutus went after the Tutsis, they would go on the radio and basically say kill them cockroaches and stuff. The reason why I bring that up is because doing my research a while ago, that I guess Honduran radio stations would say the same thing about Salvadorans, because the Salvadoreños were working in Honduras across the border as migrant workers. So a lot of it had to do with that. It was kind of like, pitting the working class against each other as they do from different countries, but it's also the national tensions, and it just escalated. And I just brought it up because we're talking about pupusas, but But it's kind of interesting that I always want to bring this guy up. I always do, because a lot of Hondureños don't even know about him, even though he's a part of the Honduran government under Zelaya. There's a guy called Dario Urraque, and I've never heard a last name like that before. That's why I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right. But he's such an amazing historian and scholar. And I've never got to talk to him specifically, but I tried finding him online. I think I guess he was a professor at Trinity University, I guess Connecticut. But long story short, he writes in Spanish and in English. but he's probably one of my favorite historians that like goes so in depth into like Honduran history and why things are the way they are. And it doesn't just touch on like, you know, like the so-called Banana Republic and how the U.S. imperialism and all that stuff, which is very important, don't get me wrong. But he also touches on local intricacies of like, for example, San Pedro Sula, which, you know, is the other really big city in Honduras besides Tegucigalpa, the capital, or like La Ceiba on the coast. But he has some really good books. I recommend them. And he talks about something that I always bring up that is a very sore subject with some people, even Hondurans, because if you don't mind, I bet you and I bet a lot of other people, it's not really anyone's fault, but it's if I ask you, what do you think was the biggest indigenous nation in Honduras? What do you think most people would think was off the top of their head? Just thinking, not even like really like analyze, just thinking. What comes to your mind?
I don't know, man. Usually people think like the Mayans and stuff like that.
Yeah. And I pissed people off over there, like not because I actually wasn't trolling, even though I love to troll. I was being serious, but the reason that's funny, most people would think that. Now, don't get me wrong. There was actually have a DVD. We went over there. They made like a field trip video of it. You know the ruins. Excuse me, Las Ruinas de Caban, which is a huge Mayan ruin and everything. And there are groups of a type of Maya, a subgroup of Maya called the Chortis. But the difference between them and the Mayas who were related to them over in the border with Guatemala, because it's near the border, is that the Guatemalan ones, are more like they still have a lot of the culture and customs. Give me 1 second. I'll be right back.
Okay, man.
I'm losing my notes. I need to get notes.
All right, brother, man. So we're having a very casual interview. I'm having a Dos Equis. My comrade Carlos Caban's having some wine. Sitting by the fireplace, lovely cold even here in rural North Carolina. I go back a long time on Facebook with Carlos. The dude has a very working class job and knows more history.
Oh, no, my bad. Sorry. I thought I was getting notes. I was gonna try to find a book I had, but it took too long. But yeah, sorry. Oh, did I cut you off? I know you were talking.
It's all right. Go ahead.
No, just like. Those like the Guatemalan ones were more, they weren't as acculturated. They still had the customs, their language, but the ones on the Honduran side, like our side, still did trade with them. They could understand them because they spoke Spanish, but it was interesting. But the point I was making is that Dario Raquel it wasn't that there weren't Mayans in Honduras. That's not the point. The point is that the Mayans were not the main group. And so if people, even in Honduras, a lot of people, like probably I would say the main, I don't say main, I don't know if that's the right word, but one of like the most prominent early dictator in the 1900s, because at that time was named Tiburcio Carías Andino. And this guy was, I think it would be too oversimplistic to call him a U.S. puppet because he literally fought against the United States. He was more of a guy who was like, he wasn't a straightforward puppet in a sense that like some others in Latin America. In a way he was, but he also tried to milk the United States too. He was one of those guys like, all right, like he was trying to fight the United States, and he's like, they told him like, all right, if we give you this and that, he's like, will you stop fighting? He's like, yeah, fine, why not? But he was very firm during the 1900s, a very firm in power in the United States. In Honduras, and he I'm trying to think. There was some really messed up incidents he did that really stand out. That a lot of Hondurans don't even know. But I don't want to jump over the place because I want to forget about the Mayan thing. But okay, so there was a guy who was a Lenca, and that was like a big group in Honduras, an indigenous group that still exists to this day. And there was a rebellion led by one of these guys, and it was mostly indigenous Lenca peasants, right? And so Tiburcio Carías Andino, the dictator, if you will, was very vengeful. He was a very bitter person, and he took it personally. But he took like this stuff personally so much to the point that he was like, all right, if these, stupid Indios, right, so to speak, want to like mess with my regime, with my power, then we're going to wipe them not just off the face of the map physically, like population, demographically. We're going to take them out of the history books. Like, how do you do that? Well, he recruited help of different anthropologists, and I think if I remember, her name was Ann Chapman. Like I said, I haven't taken notes in years. I have them all in my room, but I just try to do things off the top of the head. I'm just bad with dates. That's what I'm bad. I can't tell you exact dates. I can tell you exact, but everything else I can tell you about. But long story short, he basically made a thing that Dario Iraque calls Mayanization. Literally meant that like the base.
About what date?
Yeah, that's what I can do about the date, but approximately, Mayanization is kind of self-explanatory. Basically, saying that all entire country of Honduras was formed by Mayans, created by Mayans. All the tourist attractions are going to be there for the Mayan pyramids. Basically, like wiping out the origins of all the other native indigenous peoples, and it kind of that's not really what's the word unique to Honduras, because you know how it goes all over the place, how sometimes like, oh, we respect one indigenous group from civilization hundreds of years ago, but we don't treat the actual indigenous people like people. But long story short, what's very interesting is that, on a side note, when I say one part of his regime that's not really spoken about, I might have mentioned it to you one time or another, was that there's, I know Garifunas, for a lot of people who don't know, 'cause I don't know how people know who Garifunas are now. A lot of groups of people who were mixed from the Carib, indigenous people, from the West Indies, from St. Vincent, and a lot of them mixed were also with indigenous people, and a lot of them spread from Honduras, Belize, even Nicaragua, Guatemala. But the reason why I bring them up was because he literally was kind of like, his government was telling these people, the Garifunas, he's like, you gotta bring me, they were doing military conscription, right? Telling the men, you have to come and join us and join the army. And they're like, we're not gonna do what you're telling you. Like, why should we? We have no part of your government or any policies or any what you're talking about. So what do? We massacred them. And I don't think there's any books written in Spanish, I mean in English, even though I did post the translation that I found online on Facebook a while ago, but it was called this the Masacre de San Juan, I want to say, the San Juan Massacre, but don't quote me on it. But there is a book, I think it's called La Bahía del Sol, that's written by a Honduran Garifuna guy. But like I said, that's one example of this guy and his fuckery. Now, this is where it gets very interesting. But a lot of people, I don't know who knows this or not. That's why I just say whatever, because I don't know who knows what. I don't know what everyone. Everyone's at different levels of information, so I just act like that. There was a guy, very famous communist intellectual that you learn about in Honduran schools. His name is Froilan Turcios. Very brilliant guy. And if you, so my people out there who are like scholars of communist history, especially Central America, you guys probably who aren't Honduran, but might be like, that name sounds very familiar. Now, why is that? Froilan Turcios was loosely affiliated with Sandino, of course, Sandino in Nicaragua, and with those guys, because, it was a loose confederation. But here's the thing. This is where it starts to get really tricky in the sense of like murky, if you will. Now, I always bring him up is because, don't get me wrong, he was a great intellectual. He cared about the working class mestizos, if you will, Ladinos, like, but I know I think what the term is, but a lot of people outside of Central America don't know about Ladino. It's basically, like a kind of like a mestizo, but people who speak Spanish, but they can be technically indigenous, mulatto, whatever. But anyways, even though he looked out for the mestizos or Ladino working class people, and he was very leftist, he was an actual communist, to my extent of my knowledge. I said, this is where it gets kind of messy, right? Now, there's a great couple books that talk about the West Indian migration to, Honduras, to work in the banana plantations and everything. And anyone who's familiar at all with the whole Central American plantation segregation, all that shit, right? They know that like there was a lot of tensions because West Indian immigrant laborers were seen as being like, well, you know how racism comes in. They was like they'll be docile, but like still efficient workers. They could survive like the extreme heat or whatever. And, they were just trying to make money. Like they were doing their own thing. But then people like Froilan Turcios and the communists in Honduras, and not just them, basically any nationalist-oriented group, they made editorials and all this stuff saying a lot of racist stuff, saying like these basically very anti-West Indian propaganda because they didn't consider them Hondurans, they didn't consider them people. And I'll let you know like how they feel about actual Hondurans who are African descent, who spoke Spanish, who lived there, like Garifunas and other ones in the area. Like think about it, like they would offer some, oh, you guys are basically, simplify it, but like you guys are all black. We don't see you as being part of actual Honduran people. And what's interesting is that that kind of ties in a couple of books, like I think Dario Raque was touching on it, connects to the infamous what's his name, Jose Vasconcelos, the Raza Cosmica from Mexico, because Honduras had similar intellectuals who had that similar what do you call it, racialized mythology. And but like I said, it all ties together because it gets pretty interesting because like going back to Garifunas and the different ethnic, non-mestizo ethnic groups in Honduras. Of course, you have, for anyone who lives in those areas, knows the Turcos, and I think most people know that, Turco stands for Turks, but it's only because it was, Arabs and mostly Palestinians, I want to say Syrian, Lebanese, came, they had Ottoman passports, why they call them Turcos. And it was weird because when they came to the United States, to Honduras and those areas, El Salvador, they came with like literally nothing but like like shirts on the back, as the cliche goes. But what's very interesting is that, and Dario Raque talks about this too, how they became merchant elites. They came and they basically told the so-called criollos or Creole elites, like the Spaniard descendants, that we're going to take over, and they didn't care. And this is where it gets very interesting. They like own so many of the papers down there. They own a lot of the companies, but that's not the interesting thing. I mean, that's what elites do, regardless of race. But the interesting thing is, and I always laugh about this because it's kind of ironic if you think about it. At the same time, they came to to Honduras and stuff. And also keep in mind, a lot of them weren't Muslims. Some of them were, but a lot of them were Christians. That some of the greatest allies and merchants and the politics are actually Jewish people, like Jewish elites. And it's the reason why I said it's ironic is because, in other places, the thought of being Jewish and Palestinian elites, Arab elites, is almost seen as, heresy. But down there, it's like business as usual. Now, but like, I didn't mean to go off track. I do that all the time. You know how I talk. But the Garifuna people, there's also, I've seen this firsthand because I spent a lot of time with my friends with Garifunas. But Garifuna people speak their own language. And I don't want to I don't want to say something that's not right, but there's a lot of it's based on Carib and Taino lexicon, like the vocabulary, if you will. But there's also other groups of African descent that live there. There's also, you might have heard of them. I think they also live in Nicaragua too and stuff. They call them mosquitoes. And a lot of them like dive for fish and stuff. They live very dangerous lifestyles, and the language is very interesting because they, if describe them phenotypically, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, basically describe the physical characteristics. They are very like brown skin, like very dark brown skin. But a lot of the hair is like curly. But if you look at them, it's very, what's the word? They like, you can tell that the African descent, but you can also tell the mix with native, indigenous, Amerindian, if you will. But this is where it gets even more interesting because there's they were converted, right, by a group from Europe called the Moravian Baptists, if I remember. So they're the ones who, kind of like converted them to like their brand of Christianity. And nowadays, a lot of them have, a lot of the only way to make any money or survive is by dealing in the drug trade. And the mosquitoes, the language, when you listen to it, it doesn't sound anything like Spanish or anything like that. English, just like, I don't like using the word bastardized to use language, describe languageized, but it's very like, it's very interesting conglomerate of different dialects and things. And it's interesting about, there's, like I said, the Lencas, which is another big group. The Lencas, I'm trying to cover, there's the Bech, and the Tolupanes. The Tolupana people live in the Montaña de la Flor, which literally means, flower mountain. And over the last couple of years, I don't know if people have been following in Honduras, they've been going to hunger strikes, trying to like, go against the dictatorship, and specifically the Tolupanes, because they live in really horrible conditions. And like I said, you have different groups around like these scattered around the country. And then you also have, if I remember correctly, the mosquitoes, like I said, they're in different countries. And when mosquitoes are very interesting because this goes back to, I think we've talked about this. It's been covered many times before like by indigenous versus leftist ideologies, but how it gets really crazy when the mosquitoes, if you remember, what's his name? The guy who was in the American Indian movement, Russell Means, how he wasn't like as leftist as like Vernon and Clyde Bellecourt, but he said how like the mosquitoes in Nicaragua were being persecuted by the Sandinistas. And that that was a whole other shit show because you had some of these Mosquitos who refused to like Brooke and Rivera, they refused at the time to be backed by the CIA, so they fought against the Sandinistas and them, and it just became so complicated. But like the Mosquito's origins is kind of interesting because back then, like over 100 years ago, a couple hundred years ago, you had British pirates, fucking with the Spaniards and everything. And they would use the Mosquitos as their allies. And they like basically took the Mosquito king at the time, like Mosquito leader at the time, and said, "You're basically the new king, right?" And so like I've talked to a lot of people from Central America, from all the place, and a lot of us think, I shouldn't say a lot of us, it is a decent group of people who think that even though it's probably not possible in the future, that like if you look at the coast, like the two different the coastal areas where you have like the people who speak Creole English, it's more of like a West Indian influence, more British influence. They're completely different in almost every single way from like the inland capitals, where the people who are mestizos, like we speak Spanish, and that tension has been shown in all these different countries regardless of ideology. And a lot of it doesn't really have to do with ideology in the sense that like I think it's more of a racial, cultural based thing. But what I was going with that was the Mosquitos, even the people who defend the Mosquitos and say like they were just trying to defend the territory and all that. I'm like, well, the Mosquitos also were oppressing other people. Because there's just another groups that are smaller than the Mosquitos. Excuse me. There's like the Sumos, I think the biggest one is there's the Sumos. There's a few different smaller groupers. Excuse me, smaller groups, indigenous groups that lived within the Mosquito territories, and the Mosquitos displaced them. And some of them fought on the Mosquito side just because they had nowhere else to go. But it just gives you examples that there's not a lot of times, especially in those areas, there's no clear cut like battle lines. Like me personally. I always admired, even though I wouldn't say he was a mercenary, but he was more of like a playboy revolutionary. Like he was more about himself, was, Comandante Cero, Eden Pastora. Because he would be like, all right, he was like, all right, I'll join the Sandinistas, I'll fight Somoza. He's like, I'll fight the Contras, I'll fight anybody. He didn't care. He just, it wasn't like, he was like a maverick leader. But before I go too off topic, I just think it's very interesting that I just broke down some parts of like the different ethnic groups and down there, because a lot of people don't know this, that in Nicaragua there's parts, because before I go too far off topic, there's a couple great books by a guy named Jeffrey Gould, I think I pronounced it right, for example. There's a few different ones. Another one by I think it's called Seen Indians. I want to say if you Google it, say Seen Indians. I think the author's first name is Virginia. That one deals more with indigenous people in sorry about that. I can't. Those books deal with like the indigenous peoples in El Salvador and Nicaragua that who aren't like coastal Mosquitos, because a lot of people don't know that Nicaragua in certain parts like the Masaya and Monimbo, some of the first revolutions, uprisings during the Sandinista uprising, even the last couple of years, they were indigenous people. But what happened was a lot of them, they still spoke some of the dialect, they still retained some of the culture, but a lot of it was oppressed. But a lot of people don't think that they all exist. Like all the natives down there, the indigenous only live on the coast, like the Mosquitos and all them. But that's not true, but there's a lot of books now that have been coming out, I feel like the last decade or so, that have been talking about these smaller ethnic groups, these smaller different different ethnic groups, these different smaller groups, ethnic groups, political factions. And as I do, I always brought up to my dad, who I told you who was friends with some of the comandantes and like Ortega and all them, Daniel, even though how I feel about them, but he knew a lot of these guys. He was down there, he was helping them and or whatever. But the reason why I brought him up was because whatever, there was something he said. He was friends with I have a book of poetry, I think. The guy, I think he was a poet, but I think he was the health minister at the time, Silva. I want to say Fernando Silva. I'm so bad with names, but people will know what I'm talking about. I have the book of him, his book of poetry. But yeah, so what was I trying to go? Oh, I was going and studying. What was I reading? Yeah, I do this sometimes. Don't mind me. I go off on tangents. But I was trying to remember exactly where I was going with that. Oh yeah, how the communist parties at the time in Nicaragua opposed the Sandinistas, and I thought that was pretty interesting. Because remember, if you when the election happened with when what was it? I think when Violeta Chamorro took over from Ortega, I think the communists supported her at the time, but different communist parties. But I just thought that was like, an interesting thing. But in Honduras, there's a great book I have, only in Spanish. Like I wish someone would do. I mean, I'm too lazy to do the whole thing in English. But I could. I tried posting on Facebook. I have the link for it. But it talks about from the actual former communists, um, the history of communism, comunismo in Honduras, and the flacos versus what was it? The flacos versus the gordos. Well, the skinny versus the fat, but it referred to the people who were pro-China and first the ones that pro-Soviet Union, and they bring up some of like the most well-known martyrs, if you will, who were murdered by the different governments.
Which one was which?
Yeah. Oh, let me see. I'm trying. That's a good question. This morning. Give me 1 second now. I'm on a laptop. It's been a long time. Flacos was. Let me see. I know this. But yeah, the book is doing this. It talked about the different groups, and if you look up now, I want to say the biggest ones at the time, guerrilla groups most well known were the Cinchoneros. There was the Cinchoneros. There was the Morazan Liberation Front, I think in English. And then, but they weren't like there was the Lorenzo Zelaya group. But yeah, I'm still trying to look up. I'm sure it's been so long. Sorry, I'm trying to remember what it is. Well, I can actually get back to that. I kind of wait. I think I do. Okay, here we go. Yep, I'm right. Let's turn the book ahead. The Gordos were the pro-Soviets, and the Flacos were the pro-Chinese. But yeah, so it's pretty interesting because when I was down there, I met a lot of people. Not a lot, but I met people who were involved with the communist movement back then, activists. But I also met younger kids, like children, not children, like teenagers, older people who are also active in the revolution or activists. There's one guy, I don't know if I should say his name or not, just because I don't like mentioning people's names. He was a good kid. He was a good guy I met in Honduras. And meanwhile, while other people were like partying, we were all partied. But meanwhile, me and him will go back and forth and talk about like, Marxist, like the history of like Marxism and the history of Central America. And it was pretty cool. Because a lot of the other people our age didn't care about that, but they would just listen to us. They would like have the beer, smoke, whatever, and they would like listen to like, these motherfuckers, they're talking about some shit, and it was cool. But I'm trying to think. There was a guy. I'm trying to think of the biggest leaders at the time, the communist leaders. There was a guy called Fidel Martinez, and it was a martyr, Tomás Nativi, and that's where a lot of these groups that come out now, like what do you call it? I'm trying to think in English. What's the word? The people who fighting for the ones who were disappeared. A lot of those movements started because of that. Because the people who were murdered or disappeared under the military dictatorship. And of course, anyone who's like a intro student to Hondureño labor histories like Costa. Because even like I've seen, it's called, what was it, 1954, the banana strike. I've seen even socialist websites on Facebook that I would post about it. So that's really big. And that was a really interesting movement because it was led by communists. But a lot of people try to downplay that, and the government was, of course, terrified of that. And but it kind of goes back to what I was saying, how a lot of the African descent and mixed race people, who were laborers, they were being persecuted by the communist mestizos. And that kind of relates to something that I've kind of debated with, not really debate, I don't really like debating people, I'm discussed with Pan-Africanists and others, historians, about like in Panama and, Marcus Garvey, how at one point, like those plantations in Panama and Costa Rica, the West Indian workers there, it wasn't like they were like they didn't care, but they like Marcus Garvey's guy. They told him basically mind your own business. Like not like I say take any shit, but don't don't like rock the boat. Do what you gotta do. Don't get involved with the communist labor uprisings, which was the mestizos and some of the indigenous people. So there was tension between them, which were obviously the people who ran the plantations, the fruit companies, and they obviously exploited that and made it into a racialized thing. And there's actually a guy who writes about it at that kind of struggle in English, but in a micro, the micro level. Like he just focused on a few plantations in like Panama and Costa Rica. Like I think the Bocas de Toro plantation. And his name is Felipe Bourgeoisie, I think. He was actually became famous in the anthropological circles, sociological circles, but writing about crack fiends and stuff like that. Like, but he got a start in a book writing about, I think where he met his wife was in those plantations and the racial power structure and everything going on. And that makes it even more interesting because if you follow that all, that's where we'll go. I think we've talked about this before, and I love bringing it up because a lot of people don't really know Costa Rican history. They know the basics. But I always bring up the Costa Rican Civil War. I think talk about it because the Costa Rican Civil War is one of the biggest clusterfucks, I think, in ideologically wise in Latin America. It's kind of comparable to like the Syrian Civil War, the Lebanese Civil War, even the DRC conflict. And I'll tell you like why really quick. Because I think we talked about it before. For people who don't know, one of the main leaders, caudillos, if you will, of Costa Rica, most well known was Don Pepe Figueres. And even people who just know a little bit of Costa Rican history, they don't know him because he was that powerful and influential. He wasn't leftist by any means, but he was like I would say left-leaning, progressive caudillo. But this is why it's such a clusterfuck, because the church in Costa Rica was so powerful, Catholic Church. That's not that's normal for Latin America. This is where it gets crazy. The Catholic Church in Costa Rica wasn't like on the radical they weren't on the liberation theology radical shit. They were just like the mainstream, traditional, kind of conservative Catholic Church. Yet their biggest allies was the PVP, the Popular Vanguard Party, basically, which was also known as the largest, if not the largest, communist party in entire Latin America. So that's why that's not how it makes it confusing. I think it's kind of funny to start off with. Like here you have like a traditional, huge Catholic Church allied with the largest communist party. And one of the main leaders was Manuel Mora Valverde. He led the Communist Party for many years. So, and then it gets really confusing because in the Civil War, Don Pepe was backed by the United States, even though he wasn't a typical like right-wing military caudillo. He was basically his own man. He was like known, he was a man of the people, so to speak, and he wouldn't let anyone bully him. But then this is where everything gets really, really confusing, or like really kind of like backwards. So, a lot of people know in Guatemala, you had the guy who was overthrown, Arbenz, right? Jacobo Arbenz, who was overthrown in that coup. The CIA sponsored coup and the UFCO. But before him, the guy who started the 1944 whatever revolution was Juan Jose Revolo. And he had that whole thing of scientific socialism. So he wasn't like extreme leftist, but he was kind of moderate left wing, the most left wing leader they had. And the reason why I bring him up is because he jumped into the revolution. And correct me if I'm wrong. Hopefully I'm getting it all straight. He joined the Civil War too, but I think he backed Don Pepe's people. But then this is the funniest, the craziest part of all. Guess who joined the side of the communists and the church? Like he literally sent troops to fight alongside communists. And this is gonna blow your mind. Maybe not yours, because I think we talked about this before. But people who don't know, it's gonna blow their mind. Somoza's people in Nicaragua hated Don Pepe.
What?
Yes, and this is like, and I'm like, it bothers me. I have so many books that I could recommend that I used to post on Facebook. Because I used to, when I went to university at SUNY Albany, for people who knows upstate New York, and literally I would have to go. I took 3 buses in the morning to get there, and I had classes till night, which meant I literally had 5-6 hours in between to just read. Because I'm not going to go back and take 3 buses back and forth. But I got to read so many of these books, I would have no access anywhere else. But yeah, so that's when I started finding this out. Like, I'm like, why is no one people talking about this? And I just think that's fascinating. It makes that what's that term that they use, the cliche, but the term politics mixed with strange bedfellows.
Yeah.
Like literally, because Somoza hated Don Pepe that much that he's like, fuck it, I'm a fight with the communists. You know, like it was just all over the place. But that's what kind of bothers me is like you don't hear that much, even in Latin American history, about the Communist Party of Costa Rica, which was the most powerfulest or most organized. You don't hear about that or the connections with Somoza. And you don't hear about, you do hear about the Civil War if you grew up in Costa Rica, but you don't really get into the deep intricacies of it. But and Costa Rica, you know, has well, for people who follow Marcus Garvey or know about Pan-Africanism and stuff, it's kind of interesting because, you know, Marcus Garvey had, you know, his roots, or at least he worked, I guess, it was in Costa Rica, because they have a really interesting African population there. And so that's another interesting aspect. There's some African leftist intellectuals throughout the years. But then if you go from what was it? Actually over the last what was it, a couple years ago? I haven't had time to follow it, so I don't want to speak too much of it because I don't want to speak on shit I don't know about. But I was briefly following. There was some protests in Costa Rica, and it was a lot of it was against, like, it was about the time COVID started, maybe a little bit before. But at first I'm like reading the articles and I'm like, what are they fighting against? And it was kind of like, it kind of seemed like, to my extent, the kind of like almost like a yellow jacket protest, how it was a mix. You had far right, far left, because some of these people who were supporting the protests were like elitists, but then you had workers and peasants in it too. But it was kind of interesting because in Costa Rica, you haven't really seen that many massive protests like in other countries recently, besides that one. But it was just interesting seeing here the elitists backing it, yet you had workers participating in it, and I thought that was pretty interesting. And, you know, Costa Rica played a big role in the Sandinista revolution because, you know, what was it, Daniela's brother Humberto and others were exiles based out of Costa Rica. And like I said, Don Pepe hated Somoza. He didn't give a fuck. They're like, okay, you could have all, like, that whole shit is whole contentious, the whole conflict, the whole relationship. But like I said, like that's what, like, we've talked for a while, so you know what I'm about. But I told you, one of my favorite things to study isn't necessarily a topic in particular, but it's to find not necessarily obscure topics, like just to be like, oh, I know something happened in like the middle of, you know, Indonesia in 1963. And like, no, I don't do it for that reason. But I do like learning about obscure facts and obscure events too, because even though they might not be well known and they might not happen in places that were big, so to speak, geographically, a lot of these incidents of people affected major events. And I think one thing I told you, another thing I bring up is a perfect example. Walter Linney was a minister in Vanuatu, you know, which is a Pacific, it's an island, small, and like this very small island, right? So like, what does it matter if some, like, why some progressive minister becomes leader? Well, because he was extreme left wing. I mean, I don't know if he was, I don't think he was technically communist, but he came out, like, imagine being that time. It's almost like a Cuban situation, but it was a lot less bloody. But it's kind of like a small island in the middle of nowhere. A guy comes and says, you know what? I'm cutting off ties with imperialist powers. He's like, fuck you, right? He's like, I'm going to establish relationships with Libya and Gaddafi and all that shit. So he made this whole shitstorm. Walter Linney, you know, like, and I think that there's so many, I try to find all these different examples throughout history and how they link together, you know, and I just think that's what makes it more fascinating, because if we forget about the smaller events and the smaller peoples and the smaller individuals, it actually, that may not make sense at first. It actually makes the bigger events and the bigger things seem less, like, almost seem like less impactful, if that's what I'm making. You know what I mean? Like everything, I hate, it kind of sounds almost a new agey thing. Everything connects in the web. I don't mean like that. I mean, like, you know what I mean? Like everything's in your, but you know what I mean? Everything does literally connect in one way or another. You know, I was telling you how I love studying how, like, sailors, you know, like sailors traveled all throughout the world, you know, from different ports. And a lot of them they circulated with them anarchist ideologies, fascist ideologies, communist ideologies. And the same thing with merchants. And now think about, divide that into, like, let's say one example uses, I'll give a perfect example. You would never think that in Panama, for example, you would have merchants from India come in. So the Indian merchants would come to Panama and do business there, and then they'd bring the Indian nationalist ideology. Like the Gadar, I think that was one of the biggest ones. That was big in the United States too, like the anti-British, pro-Indian nationalist movement. And you'd be like, what the fuck? They were down there? I'm like, yeah. And then you see that they circulate that. The merchants, the sailors, immigrants, all of them. And they all brought all those ideologies everywhere, and they all went all over the place. One example I love bringing up too is how there's a couple great books that have talked about this. How I think it's The Makings of the Eastern Mediterranean, if I'm quoting it right. Makdisi, I think is the last name, if I'm pronouncing it right. And it touches on how many Italian and Greek workers, they went to work, I think, in railroads in Egypt, and they brought anarchist ideologies with them, and they started spreading. And a lot of that founded the foundation to many of the more modern, if you will, socialistic movements, the Baptists and all the other stuff. But it's very interesting when you see connections like that haven't really been spoken about. And it's not like they're necessarily swept under the rug or forgotten. I hate when people say they want to hide the knowledge. A lot of this shit is there. You just gotta find it. Honestly, some people have more access to things if you can find old papers, but it's if you look at all these old papers, I'm glad these books do. They're able to find the old paper articles and everything, journal articles that mention these things as they were happening. And you see how as far away in places like Brazil, for example, you had the Syrians coming in, and you still had Assyrians there for one. And then I brought up whole religious debates, are Syrians Arabs, right? They're Arabs. I mean, they're Christians, but they're also Arabs. So can we bring them into our country, which is Catholic? And you had all these weird debates going on all over the place about immigration, having to do with smaller, less.
You ever watch the YouTube dude, Richard Medhurst?
You know what?
Yeah.
No.
He is an amazing anti-imperialist, and he's also I think he's of Christian Syrian background, living in Europe, and he has some of the best anti-imperialist content and stuff against from the left against the sheepdogs and the capitalist liberals.
Yeah, I see him on Facebook. I haven't watched his channel. I just see his page on Facebook. Yeah. I'm gonna check. I have to check out his YouTube. There's a lot of Assyrians. The Assyrian people. A lot of them live in Australia. A lot of them are in Chicago, and a lot of them were communists. I used to post all the time. A lot of the early leaders were communists. Which is kind of interesting when you think about it. And and we've talked about. I think it was what was the thing? There was something to do with this another really small group out there. I can't think right now. Oh, but I would definitely check them out. But Brazil has very interesting revolutionary history. Obviously there's the racialized aspects and all that, but I knew prior. Have you ever watched those movies? There's a few good Brazilian movies on YouTube who used to be about the communist revolutionaries. And I feel all of them, not all, but a lot of them were all named Carlos for some reason. They were all military guys. Of course,
I gotta get on YouTube, man.
Marighella, Gaya, I don't know how you say in Portuguese. But then there was the other guy, La Marca. There's a movie, Carlos La Marca. He was another famous one.
Do you speak Portuguese as well, or can I?
No. I can barely speak English. I can barely speak any language. No, I wish though. I can understand it a little bit. Because to me, obviously they're all related, the Romance languages. But when I used to listen to Portuguese, I would try to listen to it the Brazilian channel and try to strain my ears. To me, it sounded almost probably complete horrible representation of it, but almost a combination of Portuguese. No, not Portuguese. Portuguese with a combination of kind of Italian, French, and Spanish. That's what it sounded to me. But I've had people, I've met a lot of Brazilians out here, and I talk to them. I can understand them. I mean, a lot of them, can speak Spanish, especially the ones who lived on the border with Latin America. I mean, with the the Spanish-speaking countries, because they have that dialect called Portuñol. Portuguese Spanish border, and that's what's very interesting, because I was just explaining about. I've been researching again a lot about the deep origins of Argentina, way past the shit everyone talks about, Perón and all the other shit, which is important. But saying how I don't know, if you talk to Latin Americans, lot of people was talk shit about Argentina, like, oh, they talking like this, talking like Italiano and shit. And they say, but it's kind of funny, but it's also like, why did it get to be that way? And
that's funny. That's funny. I had some comrades go there, and you know how like and they were Spanish speakers, and they said like Spanglish words like carro, and the Argentinians were like, "Es un automobile." They were like correcting them and shit.
yeah, they they're the roots of I think it's the roots of it. The roots of what do you call it? The Italians, they're Spaniards is interesting because a lot of them were peasants, and a lot of them came from different regions of Italy, which means none of them spoke the same thing. Half of them were illiterate, but a lot of them were socialists, anarchists, and they started creating one of the most biggest anarchist centers in the entire hemisphere up until the 1900s in Buenos Aires. And this is where it's interesting though, because they it wasn't necessarily a thing about Italian supremacy, but they were like the biggest population in the city, mostly. So the Italianos, they were fucking shit up. They were like, yo, we're taking over the factories, we're taking over the schools, we're making the people learn about revolution. But it was pretty interesting because, like I said, it was a culture revolution, but also it was kind of physical too. They were fighting against the military regimes. But it's also interesting that some of the regimes at that time or governments, I posted about this guy. I'm trying to remember. I feel so bad, but I posted him. He was in the early 1900s. He wasn't revolutionary, so to speak, but he was a populist. He was a very rich guy, and he was like, you know what we're gonna do? We're gonna arm the workers. I can find his name because I wrote down notes. I told you I'm horrible with names and dates, but he's like in the early 1900s. He's like, we're gonna fucking arm the workers, and the elites like, fuck that shit. And when it wasn't necessarily because he cared about the workers, but he knew that. It kind of sounds familiar, right? But he would use leftist rhetoric to instigate the workers, and he said, and he started passing laws, or said he would pass laws to revolutionize them, but he was overthrown by the elites. But what was interesting is that I hate that I've never heard of him before until recently, and I wish I remember his name. I have to look. I could actually find it. If not, I'll send it to you later because I used to post about it. But he was like a precursor to the Peronismo. It happened decades later. But what's interesting is that if we study Argentine literature and entertainment and culture, almost everyone thinks of the gaucho, the cowboy or whatever, the vaquero, but the pampas and shit. But what's interesting is that the way they portrayed the gaucho, the gaucho is kind of mixed race, but not too mixed race. He's rugged individualist, a real man, a womanizer. He lives off the land. And it's kind of interesting because you see another stereotype of the Españoles, I said the poor Spaniards who lived in Argentina and Buenos Aires with the Italians. And, they all come Gallegos because you mostly came from Galicia. Well, Fidel Castro's father was, I think his father was Galiciano or was Asturian. I'm pretty sure. Don't quote me. But they called all of them Gallegos. And in all the newspapers, you know how they made I'm trying to think of they made caricatures of the Gallegos, all these poor stupid Spaniards and shit. But I posted a couple days ago. It was kind of funny because even though these poor Spaniard, workers, peasants, they responded like, shit, we conquered your country, we conquered your people. They didn't care. It was all this breaking and shit going on. But it was kind of interesting because all these groups are working class and everything. And then you probably know because a lot of one thing I really like about they've been doing on the Afro-Latin American activism is that over the last decade or so, they've been talking about the almost near annihilation of Afro-Argentines because they literally put them in the front lines of all those wars going on. There was the war of the Triple Lions, this war, that war, Paraguay, Uruguay, everyone was trying to kill each other. Paraguay was basically we're going to fight everybody, even though we're the tiniest country. What the fuck's going to happen? You're all going to get wiped out. But the black folks...
while we're still on Argentina,
yeah, my bad, yeah.
I recently watched a documentary on Netflix. It was like a 6-part series on rock en español. It was a history of rock music.
Yes,
Did you see that? That was great. I watched all of it. I watched me and my wife. We started it and we could not finish it until we watched every episode. And there was a huge portion of rock music in Buenos Aires. Yeah, and it kind of went into the different cultures and and one of my go ahead. Well, one of my favorite groups is Scape, and they're like poor Spaniards, and they're really popular in Argentina, and in other places.
I mean, I think I always recommend, like, from what I watched, like I thought it was pretty interesting. I feel like will be hopefully in the future, because they'll be able to like do almost like a season maybe on each country, because the cover of rock and metal Latin America is like crazy, because think about like that could be anything, like looking like in every single country all the different genres, subgenres of music, different periods. But from what I heard, it was really good, but I feel like there's just so much to talk about so many times. For example, I thought it was really interesting how you had like the guys who were really famous in Chile like the 60s, 70s. I know they kind of mentioned them, the High Ross and all them, the Bropes, all like these psychedelic rock groups, but yet they use like the Andean music and stuff like that. And I always bring up like the people who were exposed to Latin American revolutionary culture, or even as people anyway who are interested in revolutionary music. Like Victor Jara is like a huge icon, but I always bring him up to people who like everyday people I know who never heard of him. Because I feel like we already know the story, but like the people who haven't heard about his story, or even people like Fela Kuti, they don't realize that like, as we know, like music is not just like about I'm not even going to rant, but you know what I mean? Like the music, people have literally died and been killed over music and died for what they stood for. And I think that's very powerful, because some people will dismiss, you know, I don't know if you come across some people, even so-called revolutionary people, will dismiss music. Like, that's that bourgeoisie bullshit. We don't need any of that shit. I'm like, well, no, it's like the music comes from, or originally comes from the oppressed people. That's why I was like studying folk music from all over the world. You know, from like I'm like I was saying, my pronunciation is horrible, but like in Bulgaria, you had the Chalaga music, which is like this, you know, like this type of pop music, and then the mobsters started listening to the Bulgaria. In Greece, you had the Rebetika music, you know. In Portugal, you had the Fado music, the folk music, which actually some of the Portuguese fascists on Antonio Salazar appropriated or tried to appropriate. And it's kind of interesting because you see that everywhere throughout history, like folk. Well, underground, even here in the United States, obviously, you know, stuff like hip hop and everything, country and all that shit. Like it's like different sectors of if you will, like the right wing, far right wing, far left, and everyone they try to appropriate music and they use it for their own fucking causes and shit. But that's whole other issue. But yeah, it's fascinating.
Yeah. That's cool, man. I usually on my program I have a running theme about revolutionary and like tones of resistance in country music, and I talk about that shit. It blows some of the people's mind. I had an interview with a dude who was. I had an interview with the dude who runs the Marxist think tank, and he has an interesting story. He was born in South Africa, but he served in the British military because he was from British parents, and now he's living in Beijing, and he runs a Marxist think tank group. And he interviewed me, and I gave him all this like revolutionary history and like rural culture and in country music and stuff. And he just never heard any of it.
What does he identify as? He's a Marxist, but
yeah, he's a communist. He's a communist, and he's very pro. He's in with a lot of groups that are really recognizing China's accomplishments. That's kind of his perspective. Yeah.
That is an interesting story. Yeah, like I was talking. I want to remember the book exactly. I think you talked about how I was talking about how like the origins of country music in the United States. But when I was mostly also talking about like the commercialization, how like these fucking companies would go to like, you know, like Nashville and shit, but like the urban, like the cities, and just take guys off the street. And they would like dress them up how they thought the really, really like rural people live, like the hillbillies. Like, like it's like the rap thing. Like they're like, oh, take kids from private schools who've never been in certain situations. This is how these people were supposed to do that. And I thought I always tell that story. That's fucking hilarious. Sad,
you know, in the damn documentary. Chris's Rock's spoof documentary on hip hop music kind of talks about it. But in the documentary that Ice Cube just did,
I didn't see it though.
He kind of talks about how I think Straight Outta Compton, they talk about how they were like they weren't really hard gangster, and they were kind of like posing it. You know, they came from like decent, a few of them came from like decent families and stuff.
Yeah, Cam. I always forget. So I always tell that story because I know people out there affiliated with all that crap, like OGs and shit.
Yeah.
But it was kind of well known even that like what's his name? I don't know if you heard of him, Cam, like Kam. He's famous for the song Peace Treaty. He had to like intervene because he had conflicts with Ice Cube and all that shit that was going on. But yeah, it's like, but you know the funny thing is that's if you're going on that stuff, like I have this, like a lot of people I love, you know, hip hop has been a love for me for a long time. But for me, it's kind of interesting because when it comes to like I have a lot of friends and younger people who also into certain types of hip hop. But it's kind of interesting when you see that how like, for example, I give a guy like kind of well known Nas, and the reason why I bring him up is because I've brought this up many times about the question of so-called authenticity, right, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like how people say like, why is it only in hip hop do people have to be like who they claim to talk about, you know, most are like why do you know, and like Nas, for example, he like people who diss them were like, you didn't live what you did, like you were just writing about it. And I'm like, I understand people want to talk about what's real, even though I think it's all bullshit, but that's whole the story. But it's also like to me, it's also like a lot of us, even back then, like you had guys like Public Enemy and shit saying we're like the hip hop CNN. We're the ones who fucking like being the journalists. We're the reporters of it. And reporters and journalists don't necessarily live what they're writing. They're seeing the word how you describe it as. I think, me personally, I think the only time like that shit should be considered like I can see why it's fucked up is like if like you're literally telling people that you're killing people and doing all this types of crazy shit and you're not. I mean, more people should be able to distinguish between fantasy and fiction. But a lot of kids will look up to that shit, and they think like, oh, because I'm living, they are. That I think there's a line there, because that's like you're actively encouraging like people to do shit. But it's weird because like a lot of the people I'm friends with in Facebook and my age group and younger. When I became friends with them years ago, kind of around time you and I did, because I was going way back, but we became friends of hip hop groups. And it's interesting because back then, all these kids from around the country, we were all like, we listen to real hip hop. We listen to the underground rap. That's the music that only 10 kids listen to. And it was kind of funny. Not that it's bad music at all. I'm not like, but it was kind of funny. Everyone had this like indie, you know, this indie mindset. Like, but it's kind of funny now. 6, 7, 8 years old later, a lot of these same guys are like completely flipped. But then the younger kids now are like the exact opposite. It's kind of like how I made a joke. I was saying how I was kind of like just a lot of my stuff exaggerated, but I was saying how back then when Eminem came out, it was like all the old middle class ladies, they're like, I hate Eminem, he's vulgar. And I'm like, a couple last years ago, they're like the same woman are like, oh, we love him, he's the only one of them who makes any sense. Because I've met one like that. But it's kind of funny how, you know, how like
that's how it is, man.
Yeah.
That's how Hank Williams
it's funny
was
to notice that in real life. Yeah. What was it called? Like me personally, what I've been listening to a lot, like I said lately, going back to like I listen, you know, a lot of eclectic stuff. I listen to literally everything, or try to. But I always find myself, you know, going back to like if it's not like you know, old school like Victor Jara, shit like that. The guy Ali Primera. I don't care what anyone says, Fleetwood Mac. Like I'm not if I got an argument, I'm talking about not just Stevie Nicks Fleetwood Mac. I mean like the original shit too. I love it all. Like I listen to James Taylor, John Denver. I listen to like almost anything. I always say, and I'm not going to discriminate against people who like to scream. Like I don't have a problem with that. I just can't listen to shit where they scream all the time. And I'm not like I always say I have friends who like follow all that shit, who do those stuff with playing bands. I'm not having anything against it. I think actually the history and of those groups and like the lyrics.
I feel you, man. I used to pretend I liked that shit like back in middle school. But now I'm an adult. It's like, okay, I'm not getting it.
But like but it's like we used to like when I was a kid, almost mid-teenager. Most of my friends, my media circle, loved punk rock, but the popular kids, they loved pop punk. So it was a big thing. They're like, Good Charlotte, Blink-182, and now I don't mind those bands. But back then, we were like, what the fuck is this shit? We got Dead Kennedys, we like the Sex Pistols, we like. You know, it was kind of funny. It was
funny. What Good Charlotte actually is very class conscious. It's funny, you know. Really? What I'm trying to say, like what their song. Lives of the Rich and Famous, right?
Which, oh yeah, okay, yeah.
That's a criticism of the elite.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Yeah. And it's like we should rob them. They
right.
Yeah.
I guess we were like the guys that back then were more like it wasn't really about like I was the only one who in my circle who was any involved in any of that stuff, like who cared about any of that stuff. But they were just more like it was the aesthetic. It was more like posers. But I know what you mean. That's exactly right. But it was like back then, like we don't give a like. But I didn't really like punk. I started to realize I listened to rap a lot more because I liked the punk's message, but I don't really like the way it sounded. I'm like, this is too much melody.
Man, but like you gotta like fucking Green Day's American Idiot, man. That shit was like that was the anti-war fucking anthem of like our generation, and this was back when music was not political.
Exactly,
not allowed to be political in music. And you could have like fuckers like Toby Keith with that crazy fucking like you could have that, and that was somehow apolitical.
Yeah,
you know, if it was super like jingoistic America lover, leave it. That was okay. But anything criticism, oh, you're getting political, leave it out of it, man. And the fucking DJ host would go fucking crazy. It was crazy, man.
I like as you're right about that. Like I never really had as I got older, I actually listened to a lot of pop punk. Like now I don't like it's not to say I'm very listen. Excuse me, I'll be like mellowed out, but it's kind of funny how like you were doing like the Toby Keith. He was like the original, almost like America, fuck yeah. He's like, yeah, if you like America, you can get out.
I fucking hate Toby Keith, man. That dude was totally paid off by the CIA and all that bullshit. Like I really love Willie Nelson. Willie Nelson's cool. He came out against the Gulf War. Yeah. You know, he came out in favor of immigrants. He went and stood with Standing Rock. But that fucking song he did with fucking Toby Keith. About whiskey for beer for my horses, whiskey for my men, beer for my horses. That is a total police state fucking anthem, and it sucks. That shit pisses me off.
Like I can't Iowa Blackbird mentioned Crash. Like that was that's so funny. Listen, like I'm from like we had. What was that? I'm trying to remember the biggest bands we listened to, but it was Crash, but it was the Dead Kennedys, of course, had the Clash, another two. There was Sex Pistols, but it was a lot of small. It was a kind of more recent ones. But what was it? Ever heard of Anti-Flag? They were big when I was younger. Oh, Propaganda.
Anti-Flag's the shit, man. You know.
Propaganda. You ever heard
about? I've heard about Propaganda, but I haven't listened to them too much.
And then there was there was so many of those, and you know. Then some of my friends went off like into like completely different. Not say different. They went to like different. What's the word? Like someone into ska. Someone into like one of my friends. Love Leftover Crack. You ever heard of them?
I've heard of them.
They went to like all these different like segments, like pro different stuff like that. And then meanwhile, I went the complete opposite. And I'm like, I'm gonna listen to hip hop, and then I listened to. I had a whole prog rock phase of all things. But wow, but like it was a funny thing. I don't know if it was I used to like listen to prog rock from every country. I posted Iraqi prog rock, literally South Africa prog rock, Hong Kong prog rock, Latin America prog rock, some of the best scenes. And you know, I used to post it. You know, I learned this from this guy, a fellow comrade from Toronto, who was a Chilean. A guy, they showed me that there was actually some of the best funk psychedelic best rock outside of it's from Zambia. Funk has made a comeback right before COVID hit. Yep.
It was mostly old middle-aged white guys who didn't really get funk back in the day, but now they're like old enough and now it's acceptable for them to like it now. But funk made a huge comeback. And I actually got to see George Clinton in concert at this little tiny fucking dive bar right up fucking close, right when he started back, because he's in his 70s. Right when he started back, you know, people are like, I don't know, I'm gonna like this old guy. I don't know what's up with that, you know. But I mean, I went to the show, they had a horn line and backup dancers and rappers. There was like 20-30 people on stage, and it was amazing. It was a great fucking concert. Next year he was playing stadiums. And I was like right on the edge of that. I got the badge on the fucking wall. I got his record and his badge. I collect old records and shit, man. I have quite an extensive record CD fucking collection. This is my pass from the concert.
Ah.
And I found this at a thrift store. This is the the 45 of Tear the Roof Off This Sucker. Funk music is cool, man.
Yeah. You probably
Yeah.
noticed you had those guys like in hip hop now, like you had Kendrick Lamar, you're incorporating it, Childish Gambino,
Yeah.
incorporating funk. I think that's pretty dope. Have you heard of what's it called? I'm trying to think of I don't know what the hell it's called. Oh, you know, I was listening to again, it's been years, but I was joking about them because I was joking about one of the lyrics. They said, remember Dead Prez? They're like the militant black duo.
Dead Prez is amazing.
Yeah, but like I was
joking about recently, but
no,
I know.
New, yeah,
fucking, fucking Ramiro interviewed Ramiro from Anticonquista.
Yeah.
I think he interviewed Immortal. He interviewed Immoral Technique recently.
I didn't get to watch it though.
Yeah. That dude's amazing, man. He got some great shit on
a picture. This was years ago.
Yeah.
You know what's funny though? Because I told you, people always said, compared me. They said the people who knew him, they're like, "You look like Immoral Technique," and so. And I used to wear rap, like, the poetry that was more political wise. They said it was similar. So when I met him, it was kind of fun. I got to take a picture with this guy. It was at a small venue out here. There's a one small venue out here where a lot of people come. And it's just very small too, but like more technique. I saw him there. I saw Rakim. I saw the Wu-Tang Clan. I saw Nas.
Nice.
But then you have like completely different. Like you have all types of band. Like
where are you based at? You based out of Jersey?
No. Okay. Okay. Do you know where I think we talked. You know where Albany, New York is?
Yeah, I know where Albany is.
Do you know what Troy in New York is? Have you heard of it?
It's kind of up there. It's like almost. I'm originally from upstate.
Yeah, you told me. Yeah.
So I call Albany like almost upstate. It's like it's still part of the city. That's still city. Yeah.
People from like. Yeah. Well, like the Tri-City, I guess in the region you have like the big ones, Albany, Troy. I live closest to Troy, but
Gotcha.
But Troy is very interesting. Actually, there's one thing that's a good thing you brought it up because Albany. I was discussing with someone from New York City. This dude who's actually very involved with old school hip hop, but he knows a lot about the street politics and about radical politics as well. And I was saying how. I was discussing with him how it's very interesting that you know as well as I do, and I have an example from Albany, that a lot of these, of course, everyone knows and they should know about the big groups like the Black Panthers, the Young Lords, such and such. But it's also interesting how there's so many different localized groups. Like up in the state in Albany, I got to meet some of these guys when I was younger because I told you my dad was involved in politics and revolutionary stuff. And there was a group literally called the Brothers. And I posted an article I can find later, like I was about from a couple years ago, about an exhibit up here. There were literally guys from the South, older black guys who came to Albany, and they were they were like militant like the Black Panthers, but they were like non-violent for the most part, but they organized in Albany. And then you have so many examples of groups like that over the world, over the country that many people never even heard of. And I just think that's pretty interesting. Troy, New York, actually has some very interesting history. Okay, obviously, like one of the most infamous riots around the Civil War time was the New York City draft riots when they killed all the black kids in the orphanage and shit. But
that was shameful, man.
Did you know in Troy, New York, they had one too? And there was a priest or pastor who like protected the black folks from it getting as bad. But it was Troy raft riots too. Was up here.
That's interesting. That's an interesting bit of history. I'm originally from upstate New York, but I've been here since I was 5 years old. I'm basically a Southern man. Yeah. And a lot of people associate racism particularly just with the South. Yeah. And they put up with the North.
Yep.
And they don't talk about how like people were tired of the fucking war that was helping to free the slaves. So they went around mass murdering black people and stuff while the fucking Civil War was going on. That's an interesting bit of history.
Did you see? Oh God, what was it? Well, I always confuse the terminology, but about please, I'm gonna say the wrong one because it's the Copperheads. I think the term. You ever heard that term, Copperheads? Have you ever talked about that?
No.
They were. I want to type real quick. I don't want to say the wrong word. I hate that. That's a good thing about having a laptop. Yeah, I was right. The Copperheads. There's a book literally called The Copperheads, and wait, sorry, I got off right. Okay, the Copperheads, also known as the Peace Democrats, were actually a very influential group within the time. Around the war, not war. I was about to say World War II. What am I thinking? Sorry, it's been a long day.
Civil War, right?
Civil War, yeah. And but they were trying to like say, we don't want anything to do with this shit. We don't want war.
Mhm.
A lot of them were actually pro-Southern, but some others were like the Scott. Like they would say, we're not necessarily pro-Southern. We just want peace. But you know that shit was wrong. Like that wasn't true. But yeah, a lot of people don't know about that. They were the Copperheads. They were known. That was a slang term. And then in Troy, New York, at that time we actually had. Okay, this is where it gets really interesting. Because up here, like in many other democratic cities, or at least at the time, you had what's the word for them? Like you had the people call themselves the Molly Maguires. They were supposedly up here, but it was pretty interesting because these guys were going around in hoods, claiming to like potato sack hoods, claiming to be like they were gonna fight the system, like fight the government or whatever, because they were like a lot of them, I guess, they were descended from Irish revolutionaries, but some people say that never actually happened. These guys were like, I don't want to use the term as Alex Jones guy said, it's a false flag operation. But they
Oh, fuck.
it was a setup. But long story short, because police officers were also Irish, they had to literally, the police officers blockade themselves into like the buildings and we're not leaving because they didn't want to fight their own Irish people. So they would have to bring cops from out of like the area to come in. And but this is during the 1800s. And then you had, I think I told you this. This is a really good piece of revolutionary history from up here. There's a few different pieces. I might have sent you the picture of it. If you Google James Connolly bust, Troy, New York, they'll show you pictures of it. And there's a bust of it in Troy, New York. It's literally next to the bus stop I go to work every day. And it's because it's a plaque. And it says in the early 1900s, he organized upstate here. Like he lived there for a few years and he organized workers before he went, and got executed in the Easter Rising. But yeah, he was here for a few years. And I guess every year or so, I missed it, the ceremony, but the Irish ambassador and a few others do a little ceremony at the bust. But yeah, I think that's pretty interesting because James Connolly was badass. A few different pieces of history like that up here, radical.
Shit, man. I think I wrote a paper on James Connolly like when I was in college.
Really?
But I procrastinated a lot, and I wrote I think I wrote like it was several page paper, and I wrote it like I started at like 6 p.m. and like I turned it in at like 7 a.m. the next day. And I wrote it.
Oh my God.
Yeah, and I think I did that a lot in college. I ended up getting like I got like B's and A's on this stuff, but that was like lower level history classes. Like I didn't real I think I got up to like my junior year. I think I got close to I was at the end of my junior year when I dropped out.
Oh wow. Yeah.
But you have like do you have any like did you go to college? Do you have any or no?
So,
the funny thing is you know more shit than fucking my professors know. I'm gonna be straight up honest with you. You know like more fucking shit than a lot of fucking professors.
It's kind of really quick. The funny story about that is I did go to college, but here's the thing. So my methodology, I said not methodology. What I meant was
methods.
Yeah,
and how you study history is a big thing.
I kind of
that's the shit that I got fucked up with when I went into my methods course. When I did my lower level history course, everything was cool.
Yeah.
But then when I got up into my methods course, the first assignment was what is better, your traditional historians or Wikipedia. And my response was, Wikipedia is often less biased than bourgeois historians because when it comes to the revolutionary figures, it's when people Wikipedia is usually biased towards the figure it's talking about because the people who want to write about it are passionate about that figure.
And it always has sources.
So when it comes to revolutionary figures, I prefer Wikipedia than a lot of bourgeois historians because their class bias is going to make them counter-revolutionary. And I wrote a fucking paper about that. And up until this time, before this, they're like, in most writing class, history class, as long as you prove what you're saying and have logic behind it, you're good. My teacher said, you're not allowed to come up with that conclusion if you want to pass this class. I was like, what the fuck? And that's about the time where I was like, biased. You're good. My teacher said, you're not allowed to come up with that conclusion if you want to pass this class. I was like, what the fuck?
Yes.
And that's about the time where I was like,
it's kind of funny because it's kind of funny because my path in that like fish, what do you call it, in academia or whatever it was. Long story short, upstate New York, I was here till like 10th grade, got into some trouble, and so I went to live with the foster family and met my dad in Honduras from I was 16 to 18. So I was in a couple of different schools down there, but I still fucked around. Long story short, when I was 18, I couldn't get a GED in Honduras. I had to go to Guatemala on a flight. I mean, a flight and go to the U.S. Embassy to get my GED. And so, you know, I was like, okay, I'll just go. But the funny thing was, I was like 18, and my foster mom was like, you know, you could drink on the plane, right? Because you get 18. So I got there completely drunk, and we got off the plane, and I think there was don't judge me, but in Honduras, I know there's real tacos and all that shit, but for some reason, I love trash food too. So up here, we all get drunk and eat Taco Bell when we don't have anything better to drink, even though there's good Mexican food up here. But in Guatemala, they had one. So literally what I did, I got off the plane, got tanked even more, ate Taco Bell, ate native Guatemalan food too, had a few hours of sleep, barely. When I took the GED, not knowing, I knew what was going to be on it pretty much. Took it that. I think went back the next day. I was still, you know, and then I did pretty good, I guess. You know, whatever. I did enough. But then that same year, a couple months after, I came back to the United States, and I had my GED, but when I even basically a 10th grade degree, 10th grade, 10th grade education. But like I said, I've been reading so much, and I thought to myself, they said, my parents like, why don't you just, you know, go and do community college, see if colleges for you. And I decided to do it for community service. Like, not community service. What am I saying? I did do community service at one point. I meant what's the word? Human services. Because when I was, you know, I've always wanted. When I was younger, I've always wanted to connect with people and help people. And not only just as, like, of course, in the revolutionary aspect, that too, but I meant more also like an individual psychological way, because I've been diagnosed with so much mental disorders and all this shit too, and addictions. So long story short, I did that, and my experience in Honduras influenced me more. So I was in the community college for like instead of 2 years, I took 3 years, because I don't want to blame anyone for it, but there was one woman who, like, everyone failed her classes. Like, everyone did. Doesn't matter how smart you were. So I failed her class three times or something in a row, or I didn't pass. But finally, I took with another teacher, and I got like 100. But after that, like it was a community college. We call it up here. It's like it's called Hudson Valley. We call it Harvard under Hudson as a joke. It's basically 13th grade. But then after that, you know, I did a lot of internships with homeless people, drug addicts, substance abuse. But then I'm like, you know, might as well go to get like an advanced degree. So I went to UAlbany, and I got my bachelor's in Latin American and Caribbean studies and a minor in anthropology. But this is why it's funny I said it, because like at that time I kind of wanted a paper to say that I knew what I did, because up to that point, everything that I learned, that wasn't like, you know, what I lived.
So did you finish or not, or did you just started?
Oh, I did finish it, but
okay, cool.
Kind of weird to me. This is gonna sound very mean. I don't mean so. I loved the department there. They had a great department. Nothing to do with them, but I didn't learn anything. I literally didn't learn anything because, like, from them. But I don't mean that. Like,
oh yeah, I got you, man.
It makes sense. It's not like an insult. What I'm saying is that I went there so I would have access to the library, because the library is one of the best in the Northeast. Because if I wanted to get books there, if I want Amazon or anywhere else, literally hundreds of dollars for that shit. And I'm like, I have a free pass to read as many books as I want. So you had a $50, no, not $50, 50 book maximum as an undergrad student at a time. So what I would do, like I said, I had all these hours in between classes. So like 3-4 hours every day. take notes. I had read 10, 20 books a day. Check it out. Just go through the whole thing. Then go after I left for the day, I'd take the 50 books with me, come back the next week, keep reading every day, keep doing 50 each week, 50 more. So it's not that I learned anything I met a few people I learned from, professors, but everything I did, I taught myself. That's why to me, it was more about getting a degree to say like I did, but I already knew all that. So there's one lady I really loved, a professor I'd known about from before, from my Googling, and she was involved in like Guatemalan research, and not just like research, but she's actively helped the Mayan folks like try to like fight against depression, but also she was involved with like one of those Argentine committees that was like trying to discover like all the atrocities and shit like that. But long story short, she's like probably one of the smartest people I met. And I went and talked to the office, and like I was undergrad, so I was getting all of those like small classes or whatever. But I'm like, can I talk to you for a little bit? So we talked for like a good hour or two the first time. And she's like, where the fuck did you come from? She's like, what? So because like we would talk back and forth. Like she would say one thing, I would throw it back, like, and just go like that. And she's like, you know what? You're not supposed to do this really, I don't think, but I have permission. I want you to come on my like PhD seminar class on Latin American power and politics or whatever. And I was kind of intimidated, not because I knew I would feel out of my element, but because these kids, they weren't necessarily elitist. A lot of them are foreign students, but a lot of them like they use all that crazy ass terminology, like all those like anti-disestablishmentarianism, all that shit that I could understand, but I don't know how to talk about that. So, and there I was just being me, and they were talking about like, yeah, so what do you feel about the hegemonic accumulation of such? And holy shit, I don't know about all that shit, okay? but it gets funny though. They were nice to me, but this is the funny part though. I always tell people this story because I think our seminar was like 4-hour class each week, and for the last final project, we had to do like a 20-page paper or something. But here's what gets good, right? But each 4-hour or 3-hour segment, because you're only a few of us, it was like the really select, people about to finish the PhD thing besides me. So each person had to do the presentation for the 3-4 hours, just them. And this is why I said it's funny, because everybody else, all professional and shit, they have all like the YouTube clips, all the professional questions, handouts, all these PowerPoints and shit. I'm like, you had to have a PowerPoint technically, but I literally put like 1 or 2 pages of basic shit on there. And I'm like, this is how we're going to do it. And they brought wine to it. I guess you could drink wine there. So I'm like, all right, can you pop that shit open, please? I took it, I drank it, and I talked the whole 3-4 hours.
I ain't seen you take a drink the whole time, man.
No, I've been good. I've been good. But I literally, I did a few hours, and it was like I did really good, but I just talked off the top of the head. But that was one of the favorite moments from that school. But like that was pretty much my like college experience. I didn't like get anything out of it. The best part was just reading there. But I told you these guys would harass me. He's like this one guy from one communist movement group. I keep forgetting what it was. But I think it was a Trotskyist group. But then I met someone online who
college Trotskyites are the worst. I got my own stories about them.
And it was an old guy too. It was an old guy. He wasn't even on campus. He was Latin America. So they I was kind of a shithead in those days.
There's a huge link between Trotskyites and neoconservatives.
Yep, I know. Yeah. I remember. But the funny thing, I think I told you this a while ago. I remember when my dad, was when I grew up in the movement when I was a young kid, and I met all these old, like what to me they were old 50s, 60s. They're all like old, like West Indian, Latino refugees, or they were like aging hipster Trotskyists. But these guys were pretty cool. Like I learned a lot from them. They weren't like these other people I've come across.
Yeah, I got you.
I'm saying that was my experience. I mean, online though, these people were weird. And like these guys were like coming at me in college. And I think I told you a story. It's kind of fucked up, but I think it's just hilarious because I love trolling people, as you know. But there's one late girl. She was very revolutionary. Her name was she was a Colombian girl from Queens. And she was like very vocal, like in a protest movement at school. She had like a group called the Revolutionary Coalition or something, students, some shit like that, right? And so I talked to her a few times, and you know, we talked about his, and she's like, you need to help fight for revolution and stuff. I'm like, all right, that's nice. I'm like, oh, that time I didn't really care. Like, it wasn't I didn't care. It was just like, there was other things going on in my mind. But she was very fiery and passionate. Like, but it was kind of funny because, well, there was like, what was it called? There was, you ever hear of this is going back to like 2012, 2013. Did you ever hear of like a killer Coke campaign, the anti-Coke campaign? Did you ever hear about that?
Yeah, man, I was cool with them because the local so-called pro-Latinx, you know, the liberal pro-Latinx fucking group, their one fucking thing a year, they would do a Fanta festival. And it was basically advertising Coca-Cola to the local Raza population in exchange for like a family fun day. And that was like the one thing, like the other than back the Democrats 24/7. This is what this one group did. So I got a hold of the material being released by the Killer Coke, and I spammed that local group with all that information.
Oh, well, she wanted like not drink Coke, and not so me.
Fucking Che Guevara drank Coke, man. You're gonna fucking blame you're gonna blame fucking working class consumers, you know, on a fucking evil fucking international company.
No, like, I thought,
I mean, it is what it is. I mean, there was a like in the Chicano community, there was this huge like don't drink Coors because they won't.
Yeah, I heard about that. Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah. And Ernesto Ayala. He recently did an interview with Ramiro, talking. It just came up, man. Ernesto did like a study session with Ramiro from Anticantista, and they were studying Stalin's writing on the national question. I'm pretty sure that was an amazing video. I haven't touched it yet, but I actually had the idea to have Ernesto I had Ernesto on my show, but I actually wanted him to come on and talk about that exact specific section that they were studying, and I think they did it way better than I could have, and I'm so glad that happened.
Did you that's kind of interesting to bring it up. I posted about it a while. I've been going back and studying pretty the interesting. I don't know if links is a strong word, but I guess Stalin and Ford, and how like Stalin admired Ford. Like I was he admired Ford's efficiency. So there was a lot of like dealings. Ford sent people over to Stalin, and that's where they created like that huge ass factory over there.
Have you ever read Foundations of Leninism? The very last chapter is called the very last chapter of Foundations of Leninism by Stalin is Russian revolutionary spirit and American work ethic. Stalin had a huge respect for the efficiency and industrialness of the American system that he wanted to implement, and he did implement a lot of the parts of it. And it was both. It was almost like he had inspiration from the American capitalist system with the harsh Soviet thing to be able to achieve the amount of industrialization that they did in the Soviet Union.
It's like there's so many different like I said, there's so many different like aspects and different what do you call it? Different aspects of like all these different things going. Like I was what was it? I used to talk about what's his face? What was his time? I can't think of the name right now. But like what was it? I think Honduras though, everyone drank coca, like Coke, but you know how the what do you call it? Plastic bags, I guess. Not plastic bags, you know, like Ziplocs, but not like with the straw that Bahia used to drink it. But like they would drink it straight out of that, and this shit, whatever they had in there, must be sugar cane or whatever. Like, that shit just tasted like it was amazing. But everyone drank it every day. We had a glass every day. Crazy every single day. But I wasn't even like caring. I was just being a troll because like being a fucking travieso sometimes. But it was funny because a girl comes up to me and she's like in the cafeteria and she's like, "What are you doing?" I'm like, "Oh, me? Oh, I'm eating pizza." She's like, "No, but what are you drinking?" And I'm like, "Oh, this." Oh, this is Coca-Cola. And she's like, she started cussing me out.
It's cold. Yeah.
Well, like,
I remember the first time I visited Mexico and I saw milk and water in plastic bags. I'm like, what the fuck?
Yeah.
What the fuck is this? And I'm like, holy shit, that's way more efficient. Why are we so fucking wasteful here? Why?
Yeah,
Yeah.
they have a thing called actually, you know what was interesting to me was finding Chinese food in Honduras. Like not finding it itself. I knew there was Chinese food over there, but eating it, I'm bad at describing food, but it was so different. And I thought it was interesting because I became friends with some people who were half Honduran, half Chinese, half Taiwanese. And that kind of led me, because I already studied the history of Chinese in Latin America, but not so much in Central America. And that led me to like all other aspects of it. And it's kind of interesting. There's a really good book that talks about a Chinese guy that talks about the history of Chinese in Panama. And it also focuses on how Taiwan and China have been fighting for supremacy, diplomatic supremacy over Latin America. You know, they want them to recognize them. But it's kind of interesting that I was just talking about someone how like I think Cuba, it's one of the few places in the world where there hasn't been anti-Chinese riots. And people, I mean, if you study Cuban history, Cuba, like the Historia de Cubanos, it's pretty what's the word, straightforward as to why. Is because you know the history of them when I don't like to use that word coolies, but it come coolies. Los chinos llegaron a Cuba, you know, para trabajar, you know, in the sugar fields or whatever, and then they learned how to speak Spanish from the Africans.
Hey man, we got a direct question from the audience. This Iowa Blackbird.
Yeah.
Carlos, could you talk about the state of politics in Honduras today?
Well, that's kind of like it's very complicated, like with anything. But I think what's very interesting is that we have to go back. I'm not going to speak like an expert, but like it's kind of interesting. I'll give you a few things of my experience from there. So a couple years, and actually, I keep forgetting a couple years ago, there was a guy back when I was there. I want to say 06 to 08. This is when Mel Zelaya was in power. Now, for people who don't know, Mel Zelaya was this big guy over there. And it's kind of funny if people know his history. Mel Zelaya's father was like, he owned a bunch of land in Olancho. Now, Olancho was like this department / province / state, whatever you say in English, but we say departamento. And he was like this big guy who ran everything. And a bunch of people were found dead in like the well at the time. And they were like activists and nuns. And it was a really big ass debacle or whatever. Now, but like I said, Olancho, that state / department, is basically known as the Wild West of Honduras, man. Everything goes. Like the Hatfords with McCoys and shit. It's like notorious for all types of crazy shit. But like they're kind of like cowboys, to simplify it. Now, fast forward, to briefly simplify it, not over, but you know, they had the liberals, I guess in English, liberals versus nationalists, or the cachurecos. And the liberals tend to be like bluish. And then the cachurecos, nationalists, are like reddish. And, you know, it's kind of like the same story in many countries down there. Both parties represent just different factions of the elitists. These different families. A lot of Jewish, Arab, and like Spaniard descents. Excuse me, sorry guys. They own, what do you call it? A lot of newspapers and companies and stuff. And long story short, Mel Zelaya was elected in the Liberal Party. Now, the Liberal platform, like the Liberals are slightly less conservative, and I'm being very sarcastic of the two. But when he was elected, he wasn't like people who knew him, they knew like he dressed like a cowboy. He kind of dressed and acted like George W. Bush, kind of. They used to call him like in English, basically like the cowboy or whatever. He was very like.
But that has very different connotations in Latin America.
Oh yeah.
The US.
They just used to make fun of him for that, but he had he wasn't like he there was nothing distinguished about him. He was just a typical guy. I wouldn't know he was a partier and stuff, but this is where it gets interesting.
And I think Zelaya was pushed to be more progressive than he actually was, because there's a huge movement of people behind him.
Yeah, like
that kind of identified with him and pushed him in that direction.
Yeah, because like that's why it's like I hated people. Not hate, that's a strong word, but when he was in power, he wasn't radical. But he started realizing that in order to get stuff he wanted done, it was mostly an opportunistic move. But he said he realized he could I could rally all these different groups, like the indigenous, the woman, the LGBT, are the radical, like he's like the creator will become, resistencia, which can libre. But the funny thing is that like I always like I always saw him through his shit. Like a lot of people knew he was fake as shit. And it wasn't like people actually supporting him necessarily. They realized that he was doing an opportunistic move. But what happened to him was fucked up, when they removed him from power. But then it was, I don't remember, guys. Remember?
Well, I mean, it was worse for the people. I mean, the conditions, like they halved the minimum wage, and then the whole country was thrown into chaos.
And then,
I mean, and the fact that he didn't stand up hard enough, the fact he's like, oh, I'm going to go on vacation, I'm going over there. The fact he wasn't trying to rally people, he was the ousted president, and he didn't do shit of trying to rally the people and build an organization to take the country back. He's like, I'm done fighting this. I'm out of there. I have money. I'm cool. Yeah. He basically like gave up on the people that were dying in the streets for him.
And that's the thing. Like, well, I think the good part about, if there's any good part, is that it helped create this massive organization movement. But then this, it gets very complicated because the interesting thing is where, his wife, Xiomara, she started running, but then you had like these couple of different guys who were like in power, Pepe Lobo, who was actually educated in the Soviet Union, if I remember, back in the day. And then there was another guy, there's a couple guys between, Juan Orlando Hernandez, the guy now, who was the guy who was all involved in all kinds of drugs and fuckery. But there was a guy who emerged when I was there. Like I said, there was a guy who was a broadcaster, a very flamboyant guy, Salvador, what was his name? Nasrallah. I think it's Salvador Nasrallah. And when I was there, I didn't really pay attention to him. Like, everyone knew him. He was like a flamboyant sports guy, broadcaster. But he all of a sudden came out of nowhere, and he jumped into the race, like into the whole politics the last couple of years. And he, like, it's hard to pinpoint his movement, his party. I think it's based around, literally around anti-corruption. But his ideology is like, if there's anything, it's very shifty. Like, it's not really a thing. But what eventually happened was they tried to unify the Resistencia de Libre, which is the more leftist, with Nasrallah's people, but they still lost. But like,
who was the second group you just said?
Oh, sorry, I talk fast. The guy is the most important, was Salvador Nasrallah, and he had the party he created was Anti-Corruption Party, but they didn't really do it. It kind of rallied people, I guess, who were like not considered themselves leftist poor people, like the radicals, but then they didn't identify with like the
I mean, it's very interesting because like that's kind of like Xi was an anti-corruption, the president of China.
Oh, China. Yeah.
Is an anti-corruption candidate, and he allies with the more communist forces in China. And then AMLO in Mexico, is also an anti-corruption. And he unites both some of the left, the more leftist groups with some of the Christian groups and some of the
I mentioned that the right wing. There's the one right wing Christian group that helped them win. But yeah, I was talking about that. I was making a joke, posting a joke, but it was a half joke, saying how it's very interesting when you study any group or movement around the world that identifies as being anti-corruption, because you mentioned some of them. And one guy who's very notorious, you can see right in the guy in over right in El Salvador, Nayib Bukele, the guy, and like he's very interesting because he's been doing shit that kind of like seems dictatorial, like having the military occupy shit. But I think his thing is that he's like a populist, anti-corruption supposedly, but he was ejected from the FMLN because people over there are pissed off with both parties. They feel like both parties don't give a fuck about them. And he's interesting because he's a very big populist. And then there's a guy over, I think he was in Pakistan, Imran Khan, who was like the cricket player, who was like based on being a man of the people, anti-corruption. It's the guy in Peru.
Just before we get too far.
Oh yeah.
I don't want to out you. Well, I'm going to go ahead and out you. You identify as an anarchist, correct?
Okay. No, it just came to. I mean, I was going to bring up I was surprised to bring it up here. Like my thing is like, I'm like if I had to identify most with the political system, it would be anarcho-communism. But
I got you. But the thing is, like some of the groups I associate with are are very, pro-China or pro-Sandinistas in Nicaragua and a lot of stuff. And I really get along with them because it's almost like my Christian roots is like stability and material advancement of the people is like, it affects me on like an emotional level. Like that is people no longer in poverty. Like that hits me so hard. But at the same time, I can get down with actual real anarchists and even some Maoists that have legitimate criticisms of that. Yeah. But at the same time, I have like this overall vision of like the absolute fucking evil of the U.S. empire and the Western capitalist system needs to be fucking stopped. So I support a united front against imperialism. I actually had a Taiwanese-based rapper who's living in Virginia who came up with this concept. He wrote this article. It was called "The Highest Stage of Class Struggle is Anti-Imperialism."
Didn't you is that you posted something like that? Like I don't know if the article you posted like recently said something like that. I don't know if it was an actual article.
I think I posted a retweet of that Taiwanese-based hip hop artist.
Oh, okay. Because like see, like the reason why, like my thing, I think I've told you about was like me personally, like me, my political ideology is so, my whole shit is so crazy. But for me, it's like I've never met of all the anarchists I've met. Like I haven't gotten along with most of them. Like, so that's why I don't really identify. But you're right. Your points are really valid points. Like for me, it's like that's where things get really what's the word? Like complicated. It's like what's that word we were talking about? We were mentioning that on the phone, like how you could be what is it, principled opposition or something? How you can like support, not say support a government or what they do, but you support them against like the imperialist threat and shit. And I understand that. I guess for me, it's just like
critical support stuff. Like
yes, yeah. I'm so bad at all this fucking terminology. Like, I don't know any of this shit. But like for me, it's like I said, my dad was like I said, I don't know if he was actually a Trotskyist, but he was a hardline Marxist at one point. So we used to always get into arguments, and we used to talk a lot about this. And like he was a pro-Fidel to the end, pro-Sandinista to the end. And he brought up some of the points you did, and I told you when I went to Cuba a couple years ago, my mom went there because her dad was Belarusian, and they went during Batista's reign, and she said it looked so much better than what it was back then. And but the reason I bring it up is because it was technically tour guide, right? But I could just go wherever I want. I wanted to try talking to as many people as possible, just to try to get as many different points of view. And I said I was from different places, depending on who I talked to, I'll say. But because I tried, I won't say how it really went in regards to anarchism, but I was trying to find, because I heard about anarchists who lived there, like younger anarchists, underground, because I've studied the history of anarchism in Cuba and how extensive it was. And the reason why I bring this, I think we talk about this, to me, it's fascinating, is that I guess I would identify more as, okay, what's that? Okay, I'm getting that term they used to always say it in before, how you can be like someone who studies Marx's economy or whatever economic theories, but isn't necessarily Marxist. They call them Marxians, right?
Yeah.
Marxist. I say that for a reason, because like
Richard Wolff is not a revolutionary.
Yeah,
he's a Marxian economist.
Yeah,
he uses Marxism for bourgeois for bourgeois academic economics.
I can kind of say like I love studying anarchist history. That really translates to anarchist history, and I do love anarcho-communist tenets. But like I said, I don't like. It's not that I refuse to identify someone. It's that my shit is so all over the place. You know, I study so many things. Like so that's what like I'm like very into like Pan-Africanism, very into indigenism. I'm very into like even though I don't believe it, I've studied almost every conspiracy theory and every type of level. I'm into Luciferianism. I'm into I was in a group. There was a whole huge online network called the Illuminati, and that's like it was called actually Apocalypse. This is going back, and people on my page, they remember this. I met a lot of them. It was called like the Armageddon conspiracy, and these were all Luciferians, And people don't really understand that aspect. So it's like for me, as a personal level, I've always had so many contradicting beliefs. And like not just even like so many different beliefs that go all over the place. Like for example, me in my personal philosophy is I think I've told you is unethical. No, it's ethical hedonism. I choose to pursue pleasure by any means possible. What distinguishes that from an unethical one is an unethical hedonist is someone who'll be like, yeah, like if I want to rape someone, I'll rape someone if it makes me happy. Mine is just that I'm basically gonna do what the fuck I want all the time. But then like at the same time, I'm very like, pro-indigenous people all over the world, like indigenous struggles. And then I'm also, a lot of communist tenets I agree with. Then there's some Maoist tenets I agree with. So, and I'm very into like a lot of different like new age, like not to say new age, but very different like alternative spiritual systems. And the reason why I say all that is because my whole thing I've always said is my whole word view is so chaotic, but somehow it makes sense to me. But at the end of the day, what I think of the most important, the way I act, is how to help other people. Like if you know what I'm saying, like there's kind of like what you said, kind of the united front, but not necessarily in a complete leftist viewpoint. The way I see it is that I'll support somebody. Basically, I support the underdog, whatever it takes at any point. It's kind of simple in that way. But as my actual like political viewpoints is so, and religious and spiritual standpoints is so like all over the place. Because everything I read, everything I learn, everything I see, literally makes me not necessarily change my foundation. Like my foundation, I said, is being against oppression in all of its forms, being against all forms of discrimination, shit like that, helping and being compassionate, defending people who need it. But it doesn't change the foundation of my personal principles. But what changes is the way I see the world in the global view. Because like I give for example, the more I study about, let's say, Singapore, it makes me rethink everything I knew about Singapore. But then because I read, my reading process is this. I'll have like 4 or 5 books in front of me when I'm in front, like on the bus or whatever. And I start reading all of them. And I'll just have random books, like different countries. And I start doing is linking them together. But like this is from Singapore, this is from like about the Midwest, American Midwest. This is about, whatever, like Canadian Punjabis and stuff. And then I start realizing that they in each book they'll mention stuff that connects to each other. That's why I'm so into transnationalism. That's why I'm into, because like, everything does connect. So when I read and I start trying to link all these things together, and that leads back to me being like, every time I think I know something that happened or a certain event or a certain political figure, it just completely changes after I keep learning more. And like that's kind of drives me crazy almost, because it's like, and it's not like I just believe everything I read. I think I always look at sources. I try to critically analyze things. It's not like, oh, Blondie believed this, that's why I'm gonna change that. That's not what I mean. But it's just like I think I told you this. If I want to study something just strictly book-wise, documentary-wise, not even talking about talking to people and experience, I mean strictly book-wise, I'll do it. I'll literally go and like, let's say I'll think of a topic off the top of the head, like Islamic communism or something. And then I'll look up every single book I can find, every PDF, everything that I can find, and I just absorb all that and take notes and all that, and then work my way through all that and try to find if I can find a cohesive, I don't know the word, cohesive, not say statement, but cohesive, balanced or whatever. I don't know what the fuck, what I mean, a cohesive, fuck, I can't think of the word right now.
Narrative, framework,
some shit like
understanding,
that.
story.
But like that's basically how it works through anything or everything. And but like I said, it also gets very complicated because I'm into so many stuff besides history. But then again, that's when I think history. I think towards history links to everything. So I include everything on like technically as part of.
Are you on your phone or your?
Oh, that's a laptop. Why? Oh.
Okay, just any way you could center your camera where your face is in the middle of the your face is in the middle of the picture, and then tilt it down where there's less negative space above your head.
Oh, like this?
Yeah, boom. You're looking good. Go ahead.
Yeah, like I said, it's my first time. Sorry, I'm always fidget too. I can't.
Yeah.
But no, so like I've like so many different things, like music, history, writing, but like psychology, almost anything you think of. But like I incorporated it all under history, if that makes sense. Because history is everything that's going on that has happened. And like I think I told you before, one thing that bothers me is that how I understand people can talk about things from an ideological standpoint. I understand everyone has their own viewpoint. I understand that. But at the same time, it's like what I've noticed, especially was in college too, but also talking to people online or in real life, going to activist meetings and all that shit. It's like people, it's not even just necessary. I'm talking about different ideological standpoints. That's not even necessary in any conflict or competition. My problem is that someone would be like, oh, my background is in psychology. All right. Another one person, my background is in sociology. And they just start like without like learning anything from each other, and that can be applied to anything, and that just bothers me. Like, why do you learn from both of those? It's like, and it completely nothing to do with history, really. It's like when you have people who are like sci-fi versus fantasy fans, or Star Wars versus Star Trek fans, or like even in music, old Genesis versus new Genesis fans. I'm like, what's the point? I'm like, why choose one in a sense if you want to learn about it all? It's kind of like that's why I said it goes. I'm not saying I agree. Like, it's kind of interesting how like I apply that to everything. I try to learn as much as I can about it, and not necessarily believe any or even half of it, but I want to know as much as I possibly can. Especially it helps you when you talk to people. I'm not really someone into like trying to convince people to believe anything. I'm not really good at doing that shit. I just tell you how I feel. So like that's what. But it is interesting to know, like, if you talk to people who identify as something completely different, and they realize that like you know more about what they do than they do, and that's just kind of interesting to me, because they said I work in a small grocery store.
I'm sure you run across that quite a bit.
Yeah,
where you find someone who's a proclaimed socialist, even a proclaimed right winger, and you will understand more about that, and especially. I noticed, man, I think we both have had issues with drinking, or we both enjoy drinking.
Yeah.
And when you go to bars, like, people really open up to you.
Yeah.
And you meet all kinds of different folks. And I bet you've had all kinds of interesting experiences and met a lot of different people that furthered your understanding from different perspectives.
Yeah, that's one thing I think, one thing I posted, I really, if there's anything I do, like, I think I have a positive quality, is that I do try to do that. Like, I try to talk to as many different people as possible about anything. Because I always feel like it doesn't matter who the person is unless they're literally evil. You can, or at least just whatever, you can find at least one thing in common with that person. And that's what I do. I'll be like, all right, if we don't want to talk about I don't know, like, if we want to talk about boxing, we can talk about fucking like music. If we want to talk about communist politics, we can talk about fucking, I don't know, the history of fucking bison. I don't know. But you know what I mean? I'm just throwing shit out there. Like, you know what I mean? Like, so that's how I build relationships, or not just like, not even just relationships. I just make how I build bonds with anybody. Like, I've met a lot of conspiracy theorists, and they'll be like, I'll shift you out, and that's how I'm like, you ever heard about Mr. Dr. Jekyll Island or whatever? And I'm like, yeah. They'll be like, wait, no. And then I'll start talking to them about the stuff. Like, wait, deep stuff. He's like, damn. He's like, I'm surprised they didn't kill you yet. I'm like, oh my god. But it's like stuff like that. Like, you're talking to people about things that they like really into, and I'll try to tell them more about, like, how do I say this? I think I've told you before, but what I try to say is, like, for example, when I tell people, I'm like, I have a lot of information or links to different types of stuff. So if you believe, let's say, what are you for? Let's say if you're pro-gun, for example. I'm just making a really example. I'm like, I'm going to give you all the information I have on the topic, on the history of it. I'm not going to tell you what to believe or what to think. I don't feel like that's my place to do anything. Plus, I don't like trying to convince people. Like, unless it's just not something I feel is my place to do, unless it's something that I don't know, it's hard to explain. But what I'm saying is, like, I try to tell people, here's all the information, you do what you will with it, and that's it. Like, that's where it goes. I'm not gonna like fucking be your fucking, like, I'm not gonna fucking sit here and tell you what the fuck I think, because you probably don't give a fuck what I think. What I tell you is not gonna change your mind unless you're really fucking malleable. You know what I mean? Like, and it's kind of funny because I meet a lot of people, especially close friends, who have completely different ideological views than me. And I don't mean like extreme right wing. I mean different, like, half of them don't even care about politics at all. They're very weird, almost syncretic stuff. Like, it's hard to explain. And like, they'll talk about like shit that, like, I don't know. I'll try to give an example. Like, one friend I have, one day we're talking about the Unabomber, and the next day talk about the Gnostic Gospel, and then bring up like the Illuminati and shit. And I'm like, that's cool because I like studying all that, but it's like, I don't know what me to tell you. I mean, I can tell you information about it, but I'm not gonna tell you what's what to believe. But I feel a lot of people are so, you probably see this all across the board, are so bullheaded and stubborn, and they don't want to change their beliefs in anything. They don't want to hear anything at all. So I'm like, what's the point of talking to you about this shit if it's not going to change your mind? You're not going to listen to anything I say. I feel like that shit is completely pointless. But other than that, I just try to share as much information with people as possible, as humanly possible, while also trying to learn from them at the same time. But yeah, that's pretty much how I do. Yeah, I mean, I think it's this is something that's actually interesting. I don't know if I've never read the whole book, but about the Obama, what was it, the father, the one about, what was it called, Letters from My Father, the famous one. I'm gonna look it up. But the reason why I bring it up is kind of random, but there was a book I read. You might have heard about it. It's very recent. It's called the Jakarta Method, and it talks about well, you know how like the infamous genocide, pretty much genocide of communist Indonesia, and but it goes into how like many of the right-wing military governments in Brazil, for example, and other ones, they used to mention that term, the Jakarta Method, and what they would do to the leftists in their countries. But the reason why I bring up Obama is because they mentioned a book from, I think it's Dreams of My Father, it was famous. They mentioned a quote in the book which was very revealing. They talked about his stepfather or whatever, Sotoro, where he named Sotoro from, and how he worked, he was Indonesian, and how he didn't really talk about his experiences, but I guess he was alive during the time of the massacres. And there's this one passage, the paraphrasing, but I posted on Facebook, but it's very interesting. And Barack, when he was younger, when he was living in Jakarta or whatever, he asked him, his dad is like, have you ever seen someone kill a man? He's like, yeah. And he's like, was it bloody? He's like, yeah, it was violent. He's like, why did they kill that man? Like, why did they kill the man? And his dad said something, stepdad said something that stuck with me. And I think it might have heavily influenced the way Barack Obama has governed. To paraphrase it, he said, his stepfather said, there's two types of men in life. There's the strong men and there's the weak men. He said the strong men, they take whatever woman they want. They make the poor man and the weak man work on his stuff, blah, blah, blah. And he's like, stuff like that, along that lines. And then he's like, so what would you rather be, the weak man or the strong man? And I just thought it was a very interesting and revealing passage, because I think that might have influenced Barack Obama, like the way he did it. And I actually discussed it with some of my friends, because you know how his foreign policy and a lot of shit, like he put like a charismatic face on fucking imperialism, but kind of maybe he probably thought like, you know how he's known for being a great orator and stuff. He probably was like, that probably influenced him. He's probably like, I'd rather be the strong man, but not being like the openly tyrant. I'm gonna be the guy who like can be the strong man while not being seen as like, someone like a Trump, for example. But I don't know, it was just weird, that passage that they mentioned in the book just made me think, because the passage itself wasn't really focusing on Obama. It was more focusing on his stepfather and how his stepfather survived through those times. But it's a really good book, though. It just came out, Jakarta Method. It mentioned a lot of stuff I didn't know, but a lot of other stuff I didn't know. And the guy is leftist. Like, I don't know if he's socialist or not, but he's like, I saw it on a socialist page on Facebook that was promoting it, so I got it from the library. But no, the Jakarta Method, and like that's another example. Like Indonesia,
Yeah, man, it's interesting you bring up Obama, because like I did the majority of my activism under the Obama administration, and I actually voted for Obama in 2008. I was young and just coming up, and like the day, and I actually heard, like the day after I voted Obama, I heard fucking Cynthia McKinney's speech that she gave at Recreate 68 about take our country back from the she almost, Cynthia McKinney has this interesting, she's very progressive and Pan-Africanist, but she almost plays in and is cool with these like white conspiracy theories.
I know, yep, yeah.
Like at the same time. And that's nothing, I'm not saying anything against her. I'm saying that is a very powerful, truly, not American, but like, of the people, like very organic formation. And I thought it was I think that's one of the best political speeches in recent American time, was Cynthia McKinney's speech back in 2008. But recently and when I was in activism at the time, I was thinking, Obama, I immediately, my religious spiritual feeling was like, Obama is killing all these people in the Arab world. And he drank the Flint water, and he's a disgusting, evil monster. But then I kind of got into like, some more psychology and archetypes. I think Caleb Maupin kind of turned me on to some stuff on how he has been like his personality archetype was perfect to manipulate for the empire's biddings. And the way, like, he said recently that like his invasion in Libya, or the destruction of Libya through the bombing campaign, was like the worst mistake he ever made. But he was told, like, he was lied to. He was told that these people are taking Viagra and raping women, and if you don't do something, some kind of horrible tragedy is going to happen. All these people are going to be massacred. And he was obviously manipulated and controlled by the people that are really, that they're really in control.
And he's, I think I told you this. I think it's funny. I remember when I came back from Honduras, was about to be the election time for the first Obama election. I think like 2008, right? A couple guys came up to me, and I knew about Obama. I've been studying him even though I was overseas. And they're like, "Are you gonna vote?" Because we were in an area that was, predominantly Black Puerto Rican. My friends were all like Black West Indians. These dudes came up to me and they're like, "You gonna vote for Obama?" And I was like, "Yeah, we're gonna vote for Obama." I said, "I ain't gonna fucking know." I'm like, "I ain't fucking voting no Obama." And I didn't get into an altercation. They're like, "Why? Are you racist?" I'm like, "Are you serious, man?" I'm like, I could break this shit down on how he's a neoliberal puppet, but you guys are gonna vote for him anyway. Yeah. You don't fucking care. But like, I didn't want to make a big deal about him. I'm just not gonna vote for him. But it was kind of fun. Like, "Yo, are you fucking crazy?" I'm like, "No, I just don't give a fuck." But I never fell for his shit. Not because, but I'm not saying like, "Oh, I knew he was bad to begin with." I just don't trust anybody to begin with. But I'm like, this guy, as soon as I heard him being a senator, giving all this peace and unity bullshit and be like the new fresh face, I'm like, they're going to use this motherfucker to be like the new Manchurian candidate. I know not right wingers have used that expression. I'm trying just to be facetious, but I knew they were going to use him as, the friendly face of imperialism. But it's funny that you bring up all the archetypes and shit like that. But what was his, the Cynthia McKinney thing? I would like to touch on that really quick. When I say her particularly, but I think I talked to you about it before, but one guy I always like to bring up who was kind of related to that. I told you my dad was involved around these guys with Lyndon fucking LaRouche. He was always fucking everywhere. My grandma used to get the fucking magazines from him, and my dad told me back in the days when he used to organize in the 70s and shit, back when LaRouche was a Trotskyist, right? Or whatever he was leftist. His goons would go and break up communist meetings all the time. And then they made that fucking shift to whatever, the extreme right. But I've been following him for years until he died. And like he would have people, like writers, scholars, whatever you want to call them, work for him, who were like very hard to pin down, like ideologically. Like they would say like shit that could be construed as like populism, right-wing populism, but then because they would attack the Federal Reserve and shit like that. But then they would like support like China or something. But then he always hated England. Like he had something against the English. Like the Bank of the Bank of London controls everything. But it's like those guys, like we talking about, very interesting me. And like one person I bring up, I know I've talked about him before, but a lot of people don't know about him. But he's very influential in the extreme right wing of the United States. Was Francis Parker Yockey. And I thought more people need to know about him. And why I would say he was so influential is because way back when, even though he was extreme fascist, right-wing fascist, obviously the biggest enemy at the time around World War II after that was the Soviets, right? But after that, he realized the Nazis are gone, right? Like they're pretty much done as a fucking organized, movement. I mean, speaking with, as a national power or whatever. But he's like, so who's the biggest enemy to capitalism in the world right now at the time? Would that be a Soviet Union? So he said that for him, even though he was kind of, at the time, he was a fringe at the time with the extreme right in the United States, like his way of thinking, he helped, I want to say, be one of the birth of the founders of like what you call third and fourth positionism, which is so huge today. But he went to Cuba to meet Fidel Castro. He went to the United States, USSR, to meet the Soviet leaders. He wanted to meet with Nasser and do all this shit because he said the only way to defeat capitalism was to unite with the greatest enemies of capitalism, which was the non-aligned movement, the communists. And a lot of people don't realize that he wasn't the only one at the time. At the time and going on from then, you had a lot of former Nazi financiers, like this guy called Guinan. It was a Swiss guy who started funding a lot of Arab, not even Arab, like Islamic fundamentalists, but Arab revolutionary groups. And you've heard like how in West Germany, like they've uncovered these files of like the Stasi of the East Germany, and how like the whole Black October and all that shit happened, how there was direct funding. Like there was a Stasi, and there was West German neo-Nazi groups, and there was the Palestinian groups, and they were all collaborating, even very loosely, because they all shared a common enemy. But so the problem is now is that, like, I don't know if we've seen it. I don't really follow leftist circles online anymore, but I do follow some people just reading, and I've seen a lot of people post about, like, what is it they call it, the red-brown threat, which isn't really new. To seeing how like the fascists are trying to like, and their positions are trying to infiltrate the left and shit like that, and I just seen all those interesting positions, and I'm like, if that's so to be true, this is not new. This has been going on for years. The enemy of the enemy is our friend. Nazis went to Nasser. Egypt, used Nazis. Syria had neo-Nazis. Leftist countries all over use neo-Nazis, and they're not necessarily mean they were pro-neo-Nazi. They're like, these guys, like, we have common enemies: Israel, the United States. Sukarno, I said, in Indonesia, who wasn't a communist but he was a left-wing nationalist, he used to always say in his speeches how much he admired Hitler. And you see like a lot of these I'm trying to give what was the group? There's one famous group, that's another one. And was it Syria? Lebanon, there was like the it wasn't the Ba'athist, it was like the Syrian Social Nationalist, some shit like Syrian Social Nationalist Party, and the guys who funded that were very influenced by very far right-wing Falange movements, like they had in Lebanon, but also left-wing Arab nationalists. And then you even saw that in South America, like in Bolivia, in Puerto Rico, for example. You'd have smaller movements that were and leaders that were extremely influenced by the far left and also the far right. Look at, this is not really an ideological thing. This is more just a regional thing. But I always bring up how, like, which is a very interesting show of regional solidarity, or tried to be, was the Falklands War, like the Islas Malvinas, when he went there. At the time, Argentina was ruled by extreme right-wing military guys, some of the worst, I would say, in the hemisphere at the time. Now, what was interesting about it was, because it was them versus the foreign power, the British, right?
Sorry, yeah. I got to go to the restroom right quick. Right. You can keep entertaining the audience. I'll be right back.
God, all right. Well, it was interesting because, what was I saying? Yeah, what made it interesting was, meanwhile, you had the Sandinistas in Nicaragua who were, left wing or whatever. But Daniel Ortega, the leader, he actually, even though he was ideological enemies with Argentine right-wing military, like they were enemies to the death, he made some, like he said, we have to stand with all of our brothers and sisters in Latin America against foreign oppression. And I understand what he was doing, and maybe it was more symbolic, but I think some people went actually to fight in Argentina, and obviously Argentina lost. But I thought that was a very interesting example of, I don't know, of like, I guess regionalism, trumping ideology. I don't know, but I thought that was very interesting because, like, that kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about how the Costa Rican Civil War involved communists and borderline fascists fighting on the same side. But I thought that was pretty interesting. That's why I brought up the Falklands War, and it's kind of interesting taking a completely different turn. But actually, yeah, sorry, I haven't been paying. I didn't know you could even look at these on the end. I haven't been knowing. I'm not used to this stuff. But yeah, the questions. Let me see. Yes, the paperclip. Yes, I put a paperclip of the Fidel Castro actually. It became found out he used SS officers or whatever to train for training. I mean, he used them to help train his officers. So that's another example. I said I'm not used to this. I didn't really recognize the stuff on the side. I didn't know that's just people asking questions, right? Oh, you know, you can hear me.
Oh man, I'm back.
Oh, sorry. No, oh, so there was something that I posted a while ago, but I started posting again, kind of related to someone saying how I thought it was interesting because I was very young at the time. I was like 9, I think. But remember the Battle of Seattle, and I thought that was very interesting. That was very influential to me, even though I was just watching it, because I thought I did a paper on it, and I think it was interesting was you had in those marches. That was, I'm not saying definitely uniting. I mean, there were all types of groups there, but you had people who were literal neo-Nazis there. You had people who were farmers. You had people who were hippies. You had people who were communists. You had everyone coming together against globalization. So the paper I wrote, I was like 9 years old or 8 years old or something. I was for a special class. It was focused on why are all these groups combining against globalization. And it was more of discussing the actual groups than the actual policies as to why. But I thought that was fascinating. And you had all those violent protests after that. You know, the ones in Genoa. You know, all those against the World Trade Organization, IMF. But then I'm not going to go into conspiracy theories. I really don't. I've really had the patience for that anymore. But
what year was that around? What year was that around?
Oh, so that Battle of Seattle was 1999, but then the other ones, the protests like the January stuff happened in the years next to that. But the reason why I brought it up was,
I think fucking the folk singer I like, David Rovix, was really involved in that.
I think he was. Yep.
Yeah. He talks about that extensively.
And then 2001 happened, 9/11 happened, and all that shit. None of the anti-globalization completely like fucking. Not shattered. I mean, it still existed, but you know, anyone who protested against any of this stuff was a terrorist. And I thought that was interesting. Like I said, I'm not gonna get up conspiracy theories.
You know what? The last guest we talked about cancel culture, and we were talking about how cancel culture originated in shutting down the opposition to the Iraq War. It was these Fox Wing people going on and basically harassing and intimidating anti-war professors. And then it happened to one of my favorite country groups, but you probably like the Dixie Chicks. It was like the first people to get canceled. Mm-hmm. And it was neoconservative, love it or leave it, jingoist people that actually started cancel culture.
Yeah, it's like I posted, like I've commented to people online, but in real life too, but it comes to this stuff. Like my personal take on the whole thing is, at one point, like at one hand, I feel like people shouldn't be allowed. I mean, I feel like I agree with freedom of speech, but at the same time, I feel like there's one point, there's people who just want to just say racist and really fucked up shit all the time, like really like, oh, we should rape women. Like there's completely that shit. I feel like. Mm-hmm. It's fun crazy, like conspiring, like promoting genocide, right? But the other side is like extreme, like the cancel culture SJWs, if you will. They don't want any dissent at all. Anything you say, no matter how, even doesn't like the problem is like a lot of times people won't even know what they're saying is offensive. I'm not making, but then if they do, they're automatically canceled and considered bigots, and there's no room for dialogue at all. It's like it's controlling. What do people call it? Like controlling. Whatever you call it. You know, word policing or whatever. It's gonna make people can't talk about anything. And I feel like that leaves almost no room for discussion, no room for agreement, no room for dissension, and that's gonna eventually escalate. But into like something. But this is something someone brought up before that I think. My dad actually brought this up when I was younger. He used that saying, the pendulum swings back and forth. So I think what might happen eventually is the cancel culture might go right back again, and like all these like so-called liberal SJWs, whatever we call them, are gonna be the ones being canceled again because people have been so pissed off. And I think it all this shit correlates. The Trump phenomenon or whatever you were, you have the SJW stuff happening at the same time. Like it's like I always say, right now in history, as a person, as an individual. It's kind of scary, but as a historian, I fucking love it. I know it's fucked up to say, but it's fun. Like I'm like and like not love
Uh,
it, but I mean I don't know if I'm making it right. You know what I mean? Like I'm like
it's intriguing. It's interesting.
yeah. I'm
It
like
makes for a good understanding
yeah,
or dialogue or
but
different battling with different contradictions.
yeah. I mean, and like I've a lot of articles have said you have we talk a little bit. There's populist leaders all over the country. I mean, all over the world, and I've been following them for years. But did you? I think it's very interesting that what was I going with that? Oh, what's his face? Oh, there was someone I wanted to mention, but I can't remember. But oh, this is something. This is I didn't mean to go completely off topic, but one thing I like to bring up that it's not really me stating anything like my belief. It's just something that I brought up that I think is kind of interesting. Is how it kind of goes back to the politics and makes for strange bedfellows. How it's interesting how like some political leaders who are completely opposite, technically, have been great allies. Like and it's just interesting. That just always struck me as interesting, and I wonder if even if they don't agree on anything ideologically, maybe it's because I'll give you examples, but maybe it's because their personalities are similar. And I told you like one great example is how Fidel Castro was very close with Francisco Franco, even though Francisco Franco was the exact opposite of socialist. I mean, right, but they were very close, like economically wise, allies. And some people give the example. They think somehow maybe because Fidel still felt some kind of tie to Spain. But other than what said that made more sense to me is that both of them were isolated in a global scale, for different reasons. So, and I think that makes more sense personally. And another example, a very famous example, is like I said, I'm gonna butcher his name. I apologize, but the guy who Nikolai, the guy from Romania, Sikorski. I'm not gonna even try. But talking about the Romanian socialist leader who was executed by the people, in Romania. Him and his wife, I think Elena. He was extremely close with Mobutu Sese Seko, in Zaire or Democratic Republic of Congo. Again, supposedly completely different ideologies, and it's kind of interesting how like there's a bunch of examples like that, and it's kind of like a lot of my Pan Africanist allies or friends, whatever you call them, they've I don't know if you see, I posted a picture and a profile picture of Mao Zedong meeting, Mobutu. And it was kind of funny how like they're like, how can we support someone like Mao who did some shit like that? Because you know how like that's why when it goes back to the Cold War, I hate people saying it was USSR versus China. I mean, it was, but it was so much more than that. Especially when you involve China, because China literally backed everybody who didn't back the USSR. I mean, people like to talk about how the United States helped create the Taliban by funding the Mujahideen, which is true. But you know who did too? China. Because China said, fuck the USSR. Like in Angola, China backed people who were against the Angolans. And then you had, I was posting, it gets even more complicated because you had, what was this group? The Chinese, I can't think of it. There's so many different groups.
It was a very unfortunate time in history when China, went off and started backing all this bullshit in the back in the U.S., acting like the damn Soviet Union was the worst thing. I think when people are like, I don't know what the fuck it is. When people are like close and they feel like that's their ally and they act like they're afraid, it's almost like they lose their fucking minds.
Yeah.
You don't start fucking acting straight. It doesn't mean like that those political organizations were horrible. It's like, shit fucking happens. I think I would like to see all anti-imperialists united because that's the main threat, but that's not always how it happens.
There's something I wanted to mention because you brought up the guy who was like in South Africa, and what's his fucking oh yeah, because you remember early I posted this. I actually had it as a profile picture. It was some actual flag banner from the early 1900s, and I want to say Johannesburg and stuff. You had a lot of Boers, a lot of these guys, Afrikaners, who were like working class workers, and they were like involved with the Communist Party. And the banner I showed it says workers. It said white workers of the word unite. And like it was the reason why I brought it up because I thought it was fascinating because if you know a little about the history, and obviously, the Africans were being oppressed, and now it's really fucked up, and the Boers were doing a lot of that. But when the war against the Boers by the British, they were putting them in camps and doing all this shit. But it was kind of interesting how some of these Boers some of them became extremely nationalistic, even more with a religious tint, but also with socialistic views. Like it's like, the I literally said, I could find a banner. It was on Google. Google, the protest said, "White workers of the word unite." And this was the early Communist Party, and obviously, the Communists ended up becoming a more radical force in South Africa. But it's interesting to realize the early history of it. And I just thought about that, that history, because what I think, regardless of what the Boers did to Africans, is not justifying at all. What the British did to the Boers is fucked up too. I mean, but the British has done fucked up shit to everybody. But I thought that was interesting how but also what's Lester talked is that even though the war was technically between the British and the Boers, Africans were involved on both sides, so they were actually fucked up as well too, which is what a surprise, right? But I just wanted to bring that up, that when you mentioned South Africa before, so I thought that was interesting. Also, did you probably knew this, but I think it's interesting how many of these leaders, like left wing, or even not necessarily left wing, but like third world, right, global South leaders, were funded or financed or backed by the U.S. or the U.K. at one point in time. And some people say, "Oh, it's because have you ever heard conspiracy theorists say? The conspiracy theorists say, yeah, they're all the same. They're all backed by the." That's not how it goes. Like, no, that's simplistic. Like, people, the CIA did, I found, in fact, did initially supposedly send money through, I think, the station chief, CIA, to Fidel Castro. But that's because they thought that he was not going to be, they didn't know he was going to be a communist. No one knew that. That's why they backed Nasser. The CIA saved Gaddafi multiple times. The CIA would, in the MI6, they gave him advance warning over 2 or 3 coup plots. Because people don't realize, like, it's almost like when Gaddafi won, like, it was not necessarily luck, but it kind of was, because people don't realize at that time there was literally multiple completely separate coups being planned. His coup just happened to be the one that succeeded, but the CIA.
I call that a popular revolution.
Yeah,
I call Gaddafi's movement a popular revolution.
Yeah,
because of the success he had, and the stability he created. I think it's interesting you mentioned a lot of groups are backed by the CIA or stuff, and people think, like, oh, if they're backed by that, then they're this or that. Man, the fucking CIA and the British, they back fucking everybody they can.
Exactly. Yeah.
It don't mean much of anything. They back whoever they fucking. I mean, they back both the candidates in the U.S. They try to infiltrate the third party movements. They try to infiltrate the left. They got their fucking tentacles everywhere.
Yeah,
and they're backing people that are fighting. They honestly, they just like instability.
Yeah,
a lot. If they can push anybody, they'll push multiple forces just to get it hyped up and create instability at times.
I think it's just fascinating when you read like what's that? The basic research, the tangled web of how crazy all this shit gets, and all these different it's kind of funny, like kind of related, but kind of not. Like, I hate when everyone talks about the deep state. I'm like, not as on both sides, only because I'm like, you guys do realize that the deep state term literally originated in Turkey, like where it was extreme right-wing military dictatorship. That's where the term originated in. But a lot of people don't mention that. And or how there's literally deep states, military deep states in like Pakistan, for example. But I just thought that was interesting because I've studied French movements for a long time. French right. I've studied the way they describe things and everything. And I told you, one of the only, if not the only pro Saddam Hussein book, I always think of this on Amazon, is written by a white nationalist. And I just think it's interesting. Like, it goes back to how some people think there's a red-brown strategic what do you call it? Alliance or whatever, or infiltration. Because I've seen a lot of neo-Nazis, white nationalists talk about, or even fighting over for Assad, and their justification is that he's better than the Muslim Islamic heathens. And I think that those connections are very interesting to me, even though just on a personal level. You know what I mean? Like I told you, the guy, the biggest. Yeah.
Do you have you ever seen that page on the internet, Flame of Liberation? It's
Yes,
done by it's done by a guy named Nick Mininachi.
That's
And
him. I know of him. I didn't know that was him.
And he is very militantly communist, and he backs he militantly backs Saddam Hussein and the Baathists for stabilizing the region, lifting people out of poverty. And he's actually involved with the Center for Political Innovation, which I'm also involved with. So I think it's an interesting character, and I think there's a lot to be said there, that a lot of communists don't understand the Middle East. They just don't fucking understand it or even try to.
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of funny. I've seen him post, like I've seen his profile post up, and there's one leftist girl I knew years ago who used to always talk to me about him, like his beliefs. Like, what the fuck is he talking? But she was Dominican. But I didn't know that he was the one behind the Flame of Liberation. But I do follow that page. I think it's very, and like, it goes back to what you're like. That's just so complicated to me because I feel like what Saddam Hussein did to his people, to his folks, but it goes deeper than him, though, because people don't realize it didn't all start with Saddam Hussein. It started with the guys before him, and it started with I just think that it's fucked up that one of the groups that helped women the most in the Middle East that started up with that was actually the Iraqi Communist Party. Like, they were notorious. It was the only party that united people across the social and ethnic strata. That's why the elites all across the board feared them. There's a great, oh God, this is one reason why I loved You Albany. There's a book, one of the biggest, literally biggest and most expensive, at least online, tomes on Iraqi and also Syrian history. I'm talking extensive, talking about thousands of pages, especially focused on the socialists, communists, Baathists, everything. It was written by Hana Batatu. And I wasn't able to read all of it because there was so much and so much information, but you could find it probably in different college libraries. But it's like thousands of dollars online if you could find it. But they had it at UAlbany, so I was able to read some of it, a lot of it. But Hana Batatu was a Palestinian scholar, and he focused on a lot of these things and a lot of the people, and so I've really studied a lot of the history of communist movements across the Middle East, as well as the Baathists, as well as the groups I've mentioned before, as well as the Phalange. And it's not black and white, even within the Baathists, like the original founders of the Baathists hated they're like, what the fuck did you do to our party? Like, they were pissed off that Syria and Iraq were going back and forth, and it became like more personalities not liking each other, and it was based over the original politics. But what our point was, I think it's interesting too, as you probably know, a lot of them, the communist parties was like a huge refuge for minorities in the Middle East, especially women, Jewish people, especially Christians, peasants and stuff. And especially in Egypt, there was a guy called Henry, I can't pronounce Kuret, I think, but he was the most famous of the Egyptian communists, and I think, I'm thinking right. And then there was, like an Iraqi communist, a lot of them were Jewish people. And you saw like that pattern all across. And it was kind of interesting because, a lot of communists in the Sudan, I know it's kind of off topic, they hated Gaddafi because, Gaddafi was, the communists escaped because they were being massacred in Sudan by Nimiri or whatever. I think it's how to pronounce it, Jafari Nimiri. But Gaddafi's like, fuck them. He sent them back. They all escaped to Libya, and he sent them to die. So if we talk to, because Sudanese communists were very powerful at one point. I used to always post about their struggles, but they just hated. I just thought it was interesting. They really hated him, that person of vendetta against Gaddafi for that. But you got to think about it. Gaddafi never claimed to be communist. He always, I just posted a couple of days ago, he would go in the non-aligned conference and go at it with Fidel Castro. He's like, he used to make fun of the USSR. He's like, you can give me your weapons, I'm not gonna do your shit. He's like, I'm not your fucking bitch. He's like, I'm not saying I'm before it or not, but he never claimed to be that. But it was very interesting. Like, you can read the transcripts I posted, or I try to find them at these non-aligned conferences when Fidel Castro was back in the Soviet, ideology.
You know what?
Gaddafi.
I think it's interesting. there seems to be like a disconnect between what the science of socialism, scientific socialism, which is basically the understanding of the material conditions, and these groups that claim that say they're communists, and then you get into these personality battles. You know what I'm trying to say? Like if you look at what Gaddafi did, irrigated the desert, invested in infrastructure, had the most prosperous nation in Africa. From a scientific socialist perspective, he was very advanced and should be supportive. But then you have these personalities that they say they're communists, and they get in these personal vendettas and those petty squabbles. It's like that's completely devoid of scientific socialist understanding and the advancement of the material conditions of humanity and the international proletariat.
I mean, it kind of like not the exact same thing, but it kind of goes to like, oh, I think it does. It I always bring up what's the guy? Fucking I don't know, Siad Barre, the guy in Somalia. He was not a communist, but he was a scientific socialist. That's how he described himself. And he helped increase the rates of literacy rates sky high. He tried to like destroy, like not technically destroy tribes, but destroy the concept of tribalism in Somalia. He tried to unite the tribes, and he was making a lot of progress. I mean, one could argue that he was the fucked up shit he did. But the point being is that after he was overthrown and everything fucked up, then that's when all this extreme tribalism exploded in Somalia. And I've seen how fucked up shit got now. But I think it's kind of similar. I think one thing I always say, me personally, I can't speak for anybody else, is kind of like what I've thought about a lot. It's kind of like what you're saying. You have to understand, like, as to study, like, how much people have been affected in a positive way and how many things have been affected in a positive way, and basically weighed upon, like, the negatives versus positives. But at the same time, this is where it gets even murkier, though, because one example I always use, and leftists will probably hate me for this, I really don't care because I don't really. Honestly, you might not, but some Latinos have actually put. Okay, I'll give through. Everyone knows, a lot of people know about Trujillo, right, in Dominican Republic. He was so horrible, and don't get me wrong, I'm not saying he was a good guy, but people don't realize when people say, like, when you bring about Trujillo, they always bring up mostly, and rightfully so, the genocide against the Haitians or even just darker skinned Dominicans. And don't get me wrong, that was a huge thing. And I'm not supporting that at all. But what I'm saying, they don't bring up also, why do you think that Trujillo stayed in power? He had so much widespread support amongst many of the population, and how he was able to not be overthrown for so long. And I want people, if you research it, and I can recommend a bunch of books, but like, of course, part of it was like he had power, like military power. But in the rural areas, the peasants loved him. Like I said, it's not because he was a good guy. No, he was a piece of shit. But he did what many smart populist leaders do, whether left wing, right wing, whatever. They create the clientelist, I think, patronage systems. Basically, he knew if he could keep the majority of Dominicans, which are peasants, not urban people at the time, or the majority of people supporting him by basically pouring money into like infrastructure and keeping them pacified, he knew they wouldn't rise up against them. Because the majority of people who opposed them, of course, were like the people on the border, the Haitians and stuff, or in the cities that were like the, what do you call them? Like the, not let's say elites, but kind of what urban intellectuals, and of course, like working class revolutionaries. But at the same time, as long as he had the power of the, he introduced agrarian land reform, no one else did that before. As long as he did that, he was able to pacify the people for a long time. And the reason why I brought him up was because to make a perfect counterpart to him, right next door, Papa Doc, Duvalier, he was also like a populist, and he was able to to become in power by using it wasn't like Black Power. I don't know the translation from French is, but like basically the blackness movement, kind of. I don't know if that's the Noriste. I don't know the exact translation, but his movement was like, it wasn't like, it was kind of like an early Black Power movement, and he was a popular doctor. That's why the poor people loved him. The people loved him, the poor people in Haiti loved him because he would go and take care of them, try to cure diseases. He was seen as like a folk hero. You know how he adopted the Haitian traditional voodoo practices. But here's where he differs with Trujillo and why he wasn't as much powerful base besides his own, his goon squad or whatever. Because while Trujillo talked the talk, he also walked the walk. He introduced huge and grand reforms, helped the peasants. But like I said, it didn't mean he was a good guy. He did it for opportunist means, but very smart move. Duvalier, once he got in power, he didn't give a fuck about them. So they didn't care what happened to him. He had no widespread support after that. Once they realized he didn't give a fuck about them, and once they realized that he didn't introduce any reforms at all to help the peasants who helped put him in power, everyone's like, fuck him. But there's a book I recommend because the Haitian Communist Party is very interesting, their history. I used to study them a lot. I've met a lot of Haitian cab drivers, especially when I visit Boston to see my brother, and I love talking to them about Haitian politics.
Man, you like Boston? You've been to Boston, man? I lived up in Chelsea for a minute.
But I'm not I'm so often, but I just like talking to the fucking the Haitian Uber drivers, man. Like stop by say Nabule, man. But they always get surprised, like, about our people. I'm like, yeah, like. But there was a really good book. I read it years ago, but I still own it. If you ever want to be interested in early, not early, but like 1920s, 30s Haitian politics, when all these different ideologies like blackness, like the black movement versus communism versus socialism versus nationalism were all starting to merge. It's called Red and Black in Haiti. And yeah.
You know what? I think you're getting into a point that I often make, is that politics is power. And when you come to power, you have to make coalitions.
Yeah.
And the great revolutionaries are people who are able to build power and unite groups that aren't usually united. And you got all these fucking Trotskyites and ultras and even some of these Maoists. They're like, got to be pure this, it got to be that. If they do this, they don't do that. But if you want power and you want any way of influencing the material conditions of the people, you got to build coalitions and build a power base. And like, people don't understand what politics is. They think politics is some kind of religion or something.
Yeah, I completely agree. I would say like, there's so many examples of that too. What I thought we might have discussed him lately. I think that's what's his face? One of my favorite political figures. Not like because I don't know if we've probably talked about him before. 'Cause I bring him up a lot, but a lot of people even here don't know about him in upstate New York or even downstate New York. One of my favorite political leaders in United States history, modern words, Vito Marcantonio. A lot of people don't know about him. He was an Italian, guy who was a political figure in Harlem in early 1900s, like early to mid 1900s. And he was a part of, he was a very, very radical left-wing guy. Now, he was perceived as a threat by the government. The U.S. government tried to get him out of power any means possible. And he was a big guy. I think he eventually died of like heart-related shit like that. But this is what made him. It wasn't that he was a leftist that was necessary to threat, even though that was a threat. It was because the districts he represented weren't just like the Italians, the old school Italians. They backed him. That's, of course, the Italians. That's what they did. It was like the ethnic politics at the time. But the black folks who lived nearby, they also backed him for the most part because they were with Adam Clayton Powell at the time, I think. But this is where it gets really interesting and why he's like a huge figure and kind of seen the threat. He also represented the growing Puerto Rican constituency. So he was so popular with Puerto Ricans and he was pro-Puerto Rican independence. They would literally fly him out to Puerto Rico, the campaign for candidates out there. That's how popular he was. He was able to unite those three different constituencies and have political sway to a certain extent over in Puerto Rico. And so the United States government, they consider him a threat. I don't know if they consider him as great a threat because he wasn't as powerful politically, but I consider them as like a much more left-wing version of like in a threat level. I mean, I say ideology-wise, as Huey Long. Because you remember after y'all, they're like, this motherfucker's crazy. Like, we gotta get him out of there. But Huey Long, I think, is fascinating because I feel a lot of people mistake what he did, like what he stood for. He said in many, like, I think a lot of what he did was good, but he said right off the top, he said, people said, well, are you doing a socialism? He said, no. When my thing is doing, my programs are the only thing saving saving the United States from socialism. Which I think it was a very telling statement. It's like goes kind of back to like the Trujillo thing, kind of.
You know,
Like,
I just want to touch, man. I gotta
sorry.
talk. You mentioned Huey Long, man.
Yeah.
I'm a big fan of Huey Long.
Yeah.
And the reason why I'm a big fan of Huey Long is Louisiana was one of the most backward states at the time.
Yeah.
And he built bridges and
Yeah,
he
he did a
built
lot, exactly,
hospitals and he gave African American people jobs that were destitute and didn't have jobs before. And this is why Huey Newton was named after Huey Long.
Yep.
I don't care if he was a communist or a socialist or what. He raised the people out of conditions and pushed Louisiana into the 21st century, kicking and screaming. What I think is negative about Huey Long is he chose the wrong fight in the larger geopolitical system. There was a fight between the more lower business people who were uniting with the Nazis at the time, and he united with them against Roosevelt. And I think that was a wrong move, but given his position where he basically, he was basically a petro-socialist before Gaddafi, before Hugo Chavez, he basically took over the oil company and used it to modernize and industrialize and lift the people out of poverty. I think Huey Long is a very interesting figure. And I think just unfortunately, he chose the wrong side in that debate between Roosevelt and the more pro-Nazi forces.
Yeah, I mean, as I'm saying, like I always call him. He reminds me of what do you call them? Like almost like a Latin American Galileo. You know, he was very populist. He was a very good speaker. He used the money to like help people. Like I think he did a lot of good stuff. I just I think, but he reminds me of a Latin American leader, like a 20th century leader. But I didn't know. You probably know. I didn't even know till after, when I was younger, I heard of him obviously, and I started researching his brother, and then his son. I didn't even know about his son until years later, like that he was a influential leader. But his brother was pretty interesting. Erlong.
Okay, man, so you're getting this shit I don't even know about, man. Go right ahead, man.
Like his son doesn't much to speak about. His son did get about politics, but his brother, Erlong was very fascinating. He was governor, not as populist, but I guess he was really well known for being a womanizer and everything. But I was going to ask you, who do you think was behind Huey Long's assassination? Like what power? Unless who was behind the assassination?
Shit, man, there was so many damn people that wanted. The Roosevelts wanted him dead. The KKK wanted him dead. The oil companies wanted him dead. Everybody wanted that motherfucker dead. I'm surprised they got away with it because it was he could go out in the streets. He's just like the other petro-socialists. Like Nicolas Maduro goes out in the streets of Venezuela and he's loved by the people and held by the people. People would have jumped in front of him. It had to have been a coordinated attack. They got him when he was alone because the people loved him, and they would have fought for him. They would have tried to stop it.
It's really interesting because I think. Well, if we talk about what was I going to say about Venezuela? Oh, I don't know if we talk about this, but I think it's interesting how Venezuela and Guyana, I don't know, they've always had this really big border territorial dispute. And there's the Rupa, I'm probably pronouncing this, Rupa Nuni, I think, indigenous people who live there from Guyana, and their conflict's been going on for years. And well, I don't know if you see that, but there was an election not too long ago in Guyana, and it kind of stoked the racial, ethnic tensions that have been going on for years. I don't know. Have you studied Guyanese history, modern? Because it's really fucking nuts.
Nah, man, go right ahead, man.
No, you would love. No, because if you have time, you would love this because it ties into everything. British, U.S. intervention. Okay, I'll give you the short story. The British and United States, they didn't want communists over there, of course, like any place, but. This what happened, long story short was that, how you had like a lot of Indian indentured servants went there, worked in the sugar plantations after the black folks left. So what that led to was that it became a huge racial conflict, ethnic conflict. But it was also, business. It was also not just racial. It was also based on who had more power and where. Because once the black folks, left slavery, they moved to the cities. So they became like urban all focused on the urban areas, while the rural areas where they used to live was where the Indians moved to. So like one had political power versus business power. Now fast forward to like the 1900, like later 1900s, there was a guy called Chetty. I'm probably pronouncing it wrong. Chetty Jagan, and his wife was named Janet Jagan, and he was like the CIA and MI6 wanted him gone because he was very leftist. He had a group called a PPP, and that was like a Indian socialist movement, like Indian based. But then they had a guy called. This is where it gets really interesting, as if it already. Forbes Burnham, African descent, Guyanese barrister. He created his own party, but this party, I think, it was mostly black, and he was. This is how people describe him, a quasi-socialist. So he was basically very pro-blackness, claiming to be pro-socialist, but he was supposedly back. You guessed it, the CIA and those guys. But what's interesting about him is that what's more interesting about him, he created like these socialist co-ops and stuff like that. He was close friends or tried to be close friends with Fidel Castro, Maurice Bishop, and these guys, even though he was basically doing the dirty work of the CIA. And this is what gets even more interesting, because guess who was in Guyana, basically on his dime at the time? Jim Jones and those guys.
What?
Because remember, Jim Jones was
fucking Jim Jones is an interesting character.
Yep.
Like Angela Davis and fucking Jim Jones were close.
Harvey Milk too.
Yeah. So it's fucking crazy. That's politics. That's politics. You want to build power. You're a Black Panther. You're a gay rights activist. You go to a church that has a congregation that's kind of posing as a communist because communists are in vogue at the time. So I mean, that's just how it is.
Most of them were, I think, because people black. There's also been people talking about ties with North Korea. Him and North Korea. Who knows? I'm not. But what's interesting is another guy. There was another guy called Rabbi. Well, his name became Rabbi Washington. He was this criminal from the Midwest, I want to say, and he all of a sudden became like a born-again Israelite or something, and he escaped to Guyana under the protection of this Burnham too, at the same time as Jim Jones, and he created his own like goon squad for Burnham, like just to fuck up anybody. And this is where you probably heard of him. This is the most famous and my favorite revolutionary of all time in Guyana. Walter Rodney. Dr. Walter Rodney was the one who tried to unite. He considered all of them black. He's like, we're all African, whether Indian or African. We just unite because we all have similar struggles. We need to unite under the working class. And he was killed or assassinated, and everyone thinks it was Forbes Burnham because he didn't want him fucking the shit up.
I think what you described was like the perfect interaction between the idea of an oppressed nation with the class understanding.
Yep, it's. I mean, and it's such a shame that he died because Walter Rodney was such a fucking legend. Like he was a perfect example of a scholar activist, you know what I mean? And the way he I don't know if you read his book, it's like the most famous book. It's really how Europe underdeveloped Africa. But like one of his most famous incidents outside.
That is the key characteristic of imperialism. A lot of leftists don't really get it. They think I had a guy. I mean, I corrected my guest last time. I think it's really good, but I corrected him because he jokingly said, "Oh, they did an imperialism." It's like, no, that's not what imperialism, a global economic system. And a key characteristic is the deindustrialization of the oppressed country. And that's the best example of that is what they did to India. When the British were in India, they destroyed the looms. The old traditional industry of textiles, they destroyed. And they had their import stuff and import, stuff for the opium, and then the opium wars, they export the system of imperialism. That's a key characteristic is deindustrialization of the oppressed nations.
What do you no, that's a good point. What do you think of what's that called? Oh God. Oh, you probably knew this because I used to post about this all the time. I don't remember if I really talked to anyone about it, but I talked to my Afghan friend, and I'm surprised he knew it because they weren't huge. But it was kind of interesting how kind of what I was saying, how China backed the Taliban, but where's this going before that? A Mujahideen. But it was a group. They were called, God. the Afghan Liberation Organization, I think it was a Maoist group, and they actually aligned. They fought alongside the Mujahideen against the Soviet-backed government. I just think that was fucking. I don't know. It's just random, but I just thought like I always thought that was fucking like Jesus, man. Like
Politics.
yeah, like there was one I was trying to mention. There was North Korea. No, not North. Oh, you know what's interesting? Like this is going full circle actually. Guess which country or nation is probably one of the only countries that's close to Myanmar or Burma, depending which ethnic you belong to. North Korea, the People's Republic of North Korea. They're very close. Also Indonesia with the DPRK. Who does Nick, that guy? Someone told me, I don't know if it's true, that you would know because you interact with him probably. Is he a Pol Pot apologist? Or does he pro the Khmer Rouge or no? Someone told me he was, but I'm not sure if it's true.
I don't think so. He's
for
Pol Pot was like communism and poverty bullshit. You know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah.
And like Nick's position is the exact opposite.
Okay, no, I was wondering because someone said
we need to build the productive forces to get towards communism. Communism, the ultimate stage is where we can take as we want and give back as we will, and that takes a super amount of abundance to achieve. So the best thing communists can do is increase the productive forces, which is the exact opposite of Pol Pot.
Yeah, that's what I said. That's why I asked, because there was someone, I guess, maybe I'm imagining, some leftist on Facebook, some guy on Facebook who I guess was openly for Pol Pot, but who knows if he was just trying to be like edgy or if he actually, who knows? Because I've met people defend everybody.
A lot of these fucking ultras, you never fucking know.
Like,
you never fucking know.
But like that's Cambodia is so fascinating, that whole area, the whole history of it. And I was even that whole even not just Cambodia, but around. Oh, this is something I want to touch on really quick because I have a couple friends, especially online, because unfortunately none of them live out here. You know about the Hmong people? They were the guys in the even. I kind of didn't really portray them that good, but they were in the Gran Torino. If you watched, they were Clint Eastwood.
I don't know anything about it, man, but I think it's interesting the kind of the rivalry between Vietnam and China. Is probably one of the most saddest things going on, because I think China and Vietnam are one of the two countries that are the strongest anti-imperialists, that are using command economies to improve the lives of their people, and they're still at fucking odds with each other, and fucking Pol Pot and all that bullshit is still fucking a factor in that.
That's kind of interesting you mention that, because like I've seen like people talk like on
shit, even the fucking the YouTube star Luna Oi.
Didn't you post? Someone posted her. I don't have a list, but someone posted. Yeah.
She is amazing. She's Vietnamese and she's pro-Vietnamese government, and she does a lot of history from a Vietnamese woman's perspective, and it just tears all these fucking ultras and Western fucking communists to shreds. Like she just cuts them a new asshole. It's fucking awesome. But even she has some like anti Chinese tendencies.
Because you go back thousands of years.
And I think it's unfortunate.
Like two Vietnamese sisters who defeated and Vietnamese are so proudful. I'll be too. They defeated the Mongols like multiple times. The Mongols could never conquer Vietnam, which is saying something. Yeah. I know they're not the same as Chinese. I'm just saying because that's another example.
Fucking Vietnam beat the U.S. Empire. They're fucking
and fucking China didn't technically beat them in that one they invaded either. I think, a lot of that, the rivalry between those Indo-Chinese and Southeast Asian now, but back when the Indo-Chinese communist parties, a lot of them were just pissed off because Vietnam was trying to dominate them, the communists,
Indo-China is like some colonial fucking
French,
shit.
No, I mean when they call themselves Indo-Chinese party or communist party, because that's where all branched out from. The Vietnamese dominated it. And they were all pissed off. Yeah.
Predominantly indigenous nations still call themselves Latino America.
Well, it's kind of like Well, that kind of blends up to something funny that like, what was his name? But what the fuck was his name? Oh, but I was saying the Hmong people. The Hmong, you probably heard of them. Like,
Yeah, go ahead. I interrupt you. Go ahead.
oh no, just saying you would hear. I thought they're like pretty famous. I guess they were the ones who fought in Laos. The mountain people, they fought against the Pathet and the United States supported them, but then the Pathet took over Laos. They were the lowland people, and the mountain people, a lot of them were put in refugee camps, or they came over to live in the Midwest, where they live now in Minnesota, but they're the Hmong people. But I'm saying it's very interesting because a lot of communists, like these guys, these mountain people got what they deserved because they fought with the CIA. But I think that's like a huge debate within, like, when it comes to Southeast Asian and communist history. But the reason why I was bringing it up is that what's very interesting is that in Thailand, the exact opposite happened. In Thailand, they also had a big Hmong population, but the Hmong people in Thailand actually joined the communist insurgency instead of the opposite way. And I just thought that was interesting, how one group in one country was completely pro-communist, and the other one literally tried to destroy to fight the communists. I just thought that was an interesting thing. I just thought that was because in Thailand, the communist insurgency was going on for years in the south, like this, and in Singapore, I think Lee Kuan Yew, the guy who modernized Singapore, so to speak, single-handedly, respected by almost every leader in the world. I think he died though. He's fascinating because he literally took power more or less by like pretending he was a socialist. Then when he got in power, he said "fuck you" to the socialists. Like basically, he's like kicked them out the way. But Singapore is very interesting in that way because the socialists were very active at one point. But like I said, he took over and basically put a stop to all that. But like I said, Southeast Asian history, especially stuff we don't necessarily hear about, is fascinating. Like I started with Myanmar/Burma in the beginning. There's so many examples of shit like that. But yeah, in Thailand's been having a separatist rebellion for the last over a decade, but now it's shifted from communists, and now it's mostly Patani separatists who tend to be more Muslims, Islamist oriented. But yeah, man, there's so much shit. Like,
man, and I would like to hear your what is kind of your understanding of Iran? I think I'm unique in the communist movement, that I'm rather supportive of Iran.
Yeah, we talked about it.
Because Iran is a beacon of stability, and it has had a lot of material advancements for the people. And I've actually read like articles from some, and they've went to war with some Iranian communists, and they've suppressed some Iranian communists, but some Iranian communists openly support the government and their material achievements and their anti-imperialist positions. And they're also influenced by Lenin. Like Lenin's understanding of imperialism influences their religious government. I'd like to know your thoughts as a very detailed, anarcho-communist. I'd like to know a little bit more of your understanding on it.
Yeah, I mean, I know we've talked about it briefly, but have you heard of it goes... He was, I want to say, recognized as one of the main architects of modern Iranian revolution. He was heavily influenced by Marxism as well as Islam. Ali Shariati.
I gotta write this down, man.
Yeah, I say Ali, obviously, and Shariati. Ali Shariati. Okay. He was very influenced by Marxism, but from an Islamic standpoint. Like he didn't, and he was very popular. He would go and lecture everywhere, and I brought him because he was a very ideological architect of the Iranian Revolution. But like, I don't know, like I understand, like I said, they have brought like the standards of living a lot for a lot of people, but at the same time, like, well, since I'm not technically a communist, it doesn't really bother me. I'm just fucked up, but like that they killed, but they did kill thousands of them. I mean, so I could see why a lot of communists would be mad. Like they had complete massacres in prisons, completely wiped out. I had family, no, not my family, but girls I knew, like they're not communists at all, and they're just Iranian immigrants, and they said their family who were communists, they would talk about that, like their parents did. I've talked to like old school Iranian communists, but the problem was, this is what happened though. I mean, my understanding, We have to go back all the way back in the Iranian history another time. But there was multiple, you probably knew there's multiple communist states within Iran over the years. There was different, like there was the guerrilla force, like forest guerrillas, and they call them. There was a small republic, a Soviet republic. But long story short, the main one you probably heard of, the most popular, the most biggest one, well known, was the Tudeh party, and they basically fucked themselves because they were like a complete Soviet client puppet organization. Like they had basically, I know I'm kind of being too like insulted, but they were. And a lot of people criticized them. Other comments said they have no free thinking, and that's what happened when Khomeini took power. They were supposed to well, people don't realize that. Well, some people do, but the communists really were so influential in the revolution, and Khomeini told them we were going to share power. Now, he could have been just saying that. I don't blame him if he knew it. But I think it was interesting how, many works of the revolution do state that there was supposed to be a shared ruling agreement. But then you had that guy what was it, the prime minister, Bani Sadr. I read his book, a biography. He was like a prime minister, and he was like a moderate leftist, and he was trying to balance everybody, which never works, especially not in those. But to answer your question, I think like if I were like just to speak from a communist, if I was a very pro-communist viewpoint, I would honestly not be able to like support Iran. I would only incense the government because they literally killed. It wasn't like a couple hundred. There was thousands of them. Thousands of them still in prison. But as it comes to like material conditions, I mean, it's very interesting because now you have. Well, you had oh god, so I'm trying to how what's his name? I'm trying to remember the guy. Remember what's his name? Ahmadinejad, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, the guy who was the mayor. He represented a very interesting evolution at the time. Remember before then, like he was kind of a populist, but like the mullahs and all of them, they didn't fuck with him. Like they're like, this guy's too independent, too much a fireball. But I don't know if you remember seeing pictures that he would travel to public transportation after. Like the people loved him until he started like going. I mean, the people loved him because he was very socially conservative, but he would make a lot of infrastructure and a lot of social programs, try to help the people with Tehran in practical means. But he was going against the elites, the mullahs, which is why they shut him down eventually. They made sure he didn't run again. But the reason why I bring it up is because it brings like a bunch of these internal faction of powers that don't even include the communists really anymore. It's more of like, you can tell a lot of the student movements, a lot of like the artists, intellectual movements, a lot of entertainers and stuff. But then even within the more like the hardline factions, you have like their internal factions, like the independent politicians. They got people with Ahmadinejad, but then you have the guy like what's the other one, the more moderate one who's around right now. I'm really not Hassani. So funny. I can't, but I think he's a guy right now, like the more moderates, but versus the more hardline clerics. But like this goes back decades ago, because when the revolution happened, you know what I'm saying, you had all these different clerics who were considered to be almost, what's the word? Too, not necessarily free spirited, but they were considered to be not too political. Because like the Shia, you had a lot of the clerics in the Najaf and stuff in parts in Iraq, the holy sites in Iraq, and there was tension between these guys, the ones who were in Iran and the ones from Iraq, because some of the Shia said we shouldn't be involved in politics. That's not all shit. We need to stick to like what we know, religion and shit. And the other ones were trying to do all radical and radicalize, which goes over to Lebanon with the Shias there. As you know what, you had, like people don't realize, because one thing I do kind of think was fascinating goes to like let's jump off topic, sorry, but like people always talk about Hezbollah now, but there was more than one Hezbollah. And not only that, before them you had Amal, which was a more secular Shia militia, and they used to fight out all the time. But the dominant faction, Hezbollah, took over, and they eventually defeated Amal. And there was multiple Lebanese communist parties. But you have to realize that in the southern Lebanon was literally massive slums of like these poor Shias. And what was the guy? The Sadr, the first one, the guy who disappeared in Libya, who was like seen as like the savior of the poor Shias. So the reason why I'm going through all this stuff, because a lot of this is all played. It's all like why things are the way they are. Why is the regional war going on between this, or the proxy war, whatever you will. But as when it comes to like Iran as a regional force. They said, just my opinion, as many other people have said, Iran, as you know, as I do, they fought against fucking, ISIS, Al Qaeda. Like they have more to lose than the United States does if the Islamic Sunni fundamentalists Wahhabis won. So I think they've done more than anybody in the region, and no one can deny that. I don't care what side you believe in. You know what I mean? Hezbollah, like they were fucking going after these guys too, man. Like Hezbollah had. The only thing though is I've talked to a lot of people in Lebanon, younger people, and especially leftists too, and you realize there's been so many protests over the last couple of years and over the corruption all over the political spectrum. And the thing is that like Hezbollah was respected for a while because Hezbollah would protect Christians who lived in the neighborhoods. But even the two rival blocks, like Hezbollah and their opponents who usually become Christians, but like I said, it's so convoluted. The political alliances are always shifting. It's crazy shit. Like you had the Christian phalangists became allies with Shia radicals and stuff you would never dream would have happened before. But anyways, the reason why I said all that was many people now are just so completely fucking pissed off about all these guys. Like nothing's ever changed. In a couple of years, another car bombing kills another popular politician who won't fucking bow down to Syria or to Israel. And so people are fucking pissed off about that shit. But yeah, I'm going on a rant. But go back to Iran. Like me personally, I think like when they killed I forget his name, the guy who was the one that Trump's people killed.
Just say just say the great general, because if you mention his name, I could get shut down on Facebook.
Oh, really?
He's considered a terrorist.
Oh, I don't even know.
The beloved general of Iran. That's what I better.
But yeah, but no, like he did so much, like the fight. What do you call it? The fight, fucking ISIS and shit like that, and so basically. From Iran, I'm very conflicted. Like with many of these countries, I can tell. Like you have to look at the positives supposedly against the negatives. But I don't know. It's there's something that's Iran is such a I don't know if tragic is the right word. I hate using that word to describe a country. That's such a great civilization. But it's like you guys know as I know that Iran has been. Maybe saying a pawn is too strong a word. I don't want them to take away the actual historical agency, but the war between Russia and England that lasted for years. They literally used those countries there, especially Iran, Persia back then it was, and like with no regard for the actual people. So a lot of these parties and movements became fucking like they actually did kind of become pawns because a lot of these elites were merchants and stuff. And they basically had to choose.
I mean, when you're powerless, you don't have much of an option. I think a reason why the Islamists came to power because of the anti-communism under the Shah. They basically destroyed and weakened the communist parties. It's no wonder that the Islamists came to power. But I mean, it was a popular revolution. It was supported by the rural people, and the rural people have achieved vast material achievements. If you look at the standard of living under the Shah of the rural Iranians to today, it's night and day. It's almost a similar story to China, with the poverty alleviation there.
Yeah, I think just to say something kind of funny, I think I don't know if you ever conspiracy theories are everywhere. Did you ever see the page that claims, that Khomeini was an MI6 agent? I just think it's funny. They posted pictures that he was really an MI6 agent. I don't know. I thought that was funny. It's been floating around for years. I just thought that was hilarious. But what's interesting is if you study early 1900s Iran, the Qajar Revolution, I think it was, that was supposed to change everything, and it was mostly like promising reforms and nothing really happened. But I think people mention most of that. A lot of people mention him and him nationalizing the oil. I think he was playing with fire though, because at that time the communists were becoming more and more powerful. But then again, like you've seen in any country that the CIA or any other of these people have destabilized, they didn't even have to be communists. They just had to be somewhere to the left of like fascism. Yeah, which is sad too. But most of that to me was just a tragic figure. But no, it should be interesting. Oh, that's what before I forget. You might have heard of him. Probably my favorite leftist historian. He's not like a fanatical ultra leftist, but he is an Iranian leftist historian, very good on Iran. He's very famous. He actually wrote a book. Well, he was a co-author. There was three. It was him, the Disraeli guy, and then the guy who talks about North Korea, Bruce Cummings, DPRK. They made a book about like when the Axis of Evil bullshit came out, debunking that shit. But no, his name is Irvand Abrahamian, and he's writing on some really good books on the left on Iran. But if you want to read a book specifically by an Iranian, specifically why it's called The Failure of the Left in Iran, which gets to the evolution of the actual secular left and why they failed. It's literally called, it's a classic. I read it a long time ago. Yeah, it's called I was right, The Failure of the Iranian Left in Iran. And I think the author, Failure of the Left in Iran. Yeah, I think, give me 1 second. I'm trying to find the author. It's Barani or something. Yeah, but the failure of the I don't know. But yeah, that's a really good in-depth book. But yeah, so those guys are really good. But the one book I read that's really interesting is Islamic Revolution by Michael Axworthy. That's very detailed. But yeah, I thought it was the excuse me. But like I said, one thing was that, like I said, the Two-Dead Party, the main Communist Party, like I said, they were so fanatically dedicated to Stalin, and they were so dogmatic in the sense that they couldn't really, because of all this shit, they weren't able to really appeal to any of the workers and students, which is why
that's how I started as a communist. How I started as a communist, I was trained by dedicated Marxist Leninists who are loyal to Stalin.
I think you told me that.
That's how I was trained. And I actually been to international conference where I met people from the Tudor Party, which is interesting now that I support the Islamists, even though I've known and met these people that were suppressed by them, and I've heard the stories of them being suppressed. But from my position as a person living in absolute poverty in the United States, trying to say fucking 8 people in a 2-bedroom trailer down a mile-long dirt road, like anybody being lifted out of poverty, that is like a spiritual fucking thing for me. Like that is my goal in communism, is to lift the material conditions of the people. And I don't give a fuck. I don't give a fuck if they killed this or killed that. We need to I want to end poverty by any means necessary. And maybe I'm fucked up for that, but that's just it, because I felt it, I know it. And then it's just like and I don't know, like my spiritual connection with anybody is having to go through war and all this bullshit, this fucking system But you go ahead. Sorry to interrupt you, man.
No,
probably the most unfortunate thing about Iran was the conflict between Saddam and the Islamic Revolution. I mean, these were both anti-imperialist forces that were doing positive things in their country, and just fucking and then they were funded by the United States on both sides, and then just fucking slaughtered each other.
And then Israel involved, and China involved.
China, it was fucking tragic.
And Israel, that was the Israel getting involved was even crazier. Oh my god. I think I did from the Iranian side. Yeah, I think North Korea provided weapons to both sides too, if I don't remember. But yeah, I know that was such a crazy. There was like so many. I don't know, like. I'm trying to remember. There was a specific incident when I think the Iraqis supposedly used chemical warfare on the Iranians, but then they said the Iranians used it on themselves. I just remember that incident stuck out. But it was just really interesting reading about, horrific, but interesting from a historical point of view, of how many young Iranian males, they were sent to the battlefield like as volunteers, basically suicide soldiers, and how much the ridiculous loss of life and all the massive carnage and loss, and it set back the area a long time. And furthermore, how it involved other groups in the nation. I mean, other other nations in the area. I think, what was it? Gaddafi, I think, supported. What was it? I forget which side he supported. I forget real quick. I mean, I remember he
Shit,
hated
that
one of
would
them.
be interesting. That'd be interesting to know which side.
Yeah,
Gaddafi supported.
he supported Iran because
Shit.
he hated Saddam. I
Mm.
forget. That's what I thought. Yeah, Gaddafi. He said, I don't, he's like basically fuck you, Saddam, and he's
You know,
supported
you
Iran.
know. I actually one of the trucking companies I went with. I didn't make it through orientation.
Mhm.
No, I didn't make it through the training process because 2 weeks in, I got a little bit happy and celebrated. They caught me with alcohol in my breath coming back in. I ended up getting fired from them. They put on my record it was failure to follow company policy. Because if they wouldn't have done that, I would have fucked my whole shit up.
Okay,
but luckily that shit didn't happen. But I actually was trained by what do you call the desert? A Bedouin. This dude, he looked like just kind of like a tanned white dude. And I started talking with him. He was a Bedouin who had a PhD in theology, and he spoke Aramaic. And I was like, and he acted like a regular North Carolinian white dude, you know what I'm trying to say? And he ended up marrying this Israeli lady, and he said it was a thing of pride that like an Arab would marry an Israeli thing. It's like I conquered Israel. Some kind of like machismo bullshit. But he was very interesting. He what he said about Gaddafi was that I think Gaddafi tried to be like the king, was Bedouin, I believe, and he tried to be the king of the Bedouins. But the Bedouins were like an independent, strong people that no one can govern. They're one of the last nomadic tribal peoples, and the Bedouins ended up hating Gaddafi.
I mean, okay. This is kind of interesting. What was this? Have you ever seen? Actually, this is a good movie. It ties into it. Okay. You ever heard of Mokhtar? Omar al-Mokhtar? There's a movie called The Line of the Desert, and Gaddafi partially funded it. He was the Italian revolution. No, he was the revolutionary leader who helped free Libya from the Italians, and he was known for being like not cruel. Like he said that his people would ask him, why didn't we just butcher the Italians and the prisoner POWs if they do the same to us? He's like, well, just because they act like that, we're going to show them this is not who we are. But I mentioned him because after the revolution, the uprising, whatever you want to call it, the insurgency, whatever, the fucking coup, both the rebels used the flag that Muqtada did, which was interesting. But no, the interesting thing you said, the Bedouin, I thought it was fascinating is that his tribe or whatever, they were like, he had a few tribes that were he was very smart. Gaddafi, besides his home tribe, he financed and supported certain tribes because he knew that without them, he would fall. That's what anyone does in the area. But what was interesting was I've been studying, I used to post articles about it since the early 2000s, was what happened. Like there was a certain town, sorry, this thing keeps going off. There was a certain amount of like violence that would always happen to flare up every so often in Libya and the cities. And he never stopped it. And the reason why was because, all these Africans were coming to work there, but the locals didn't want them there because they thought they were taking their jobs. And they were really mad at Gaddafi. And Gaddafi, they would never suppress the riots. But these happened all the time in the early 2000s. But it never really made the news. It would always be in the news, but never really made the news because at that time, remember, that was about when towards that time started passing on, we had after 9/11, remember, that's when the CIA and MI6 became best buddies with Gaddafi again. And, they brought political dissidents to Gaddafi and he did, and shit like that. So they never really started publishing bad stuff about him up until after again, which is kind of interesting. But the reason why I brought it up was because there was, it was true that there were certain, tribes like that in Africans, our tribes, I'm confusing. There were certain African groups that Gaddafi basically, he didn't really give a fuck what happened to them because he figured better they attack them than me. But that's just playing politics, unfortunately. You've read the Green Book, he was talking about black people in there, and it was just kind of like, what the fuck? Like, it was like, have you read this shit? Like, I posted it. It was just some really weird shit. He's like, black people are lazy and indolent, and they need to, like, it was just, and he talked about women being like procreators and shit like that. I mean, there was some really weird shit. But I remember reading the Green Book, and I don't know, it just that was an experience. I read it in college for the first time, and I was drunk.
You know the CPI actually republished it with an introduction.
Really?
Yeah. It's pretty good. I have several. Well, it's just a recopying of the Green Book, because it's such a it's a very important political document that not many people read or understand.
Yeah, I'm saying. See, that's just something that goes back to this debate.
And there's both negative and positive stuff in it. Like, he talks about his ways of irrigating the desert, and like there's stuff that's really
and all that shit. That's my favorite part, I think.
Yeah.
But you know what I thought was really interesting? I think it was one of the last parts. It was he was talking about, if I remember correctly, he was talking about like sports, but like violent sports, and how I felt like, like almost like wrestling, boxing, stuff like that, and how I feel like that would become obsolete in the future. It was just a very interesting section. Like, he was talking about like, but he, what was it called? There was something about Libya too that, that's what I say. It's not Libya, but I don't want to jump up. I don't know if we talked about it, but it's one subject that it's kind of become, not say a hot button topic, but it's been brought up again with the Polisario Front, the Western Sahara people there, the Sahrawi people, basically the last colony in in Africa. And it's very interesting because like this Polisario Front has run these camps for years, and there's a huge controversy because some people say they kidnapped these youth in the camps to send them to train in Cuba because they were leftists technically. But it's interesting because it's all about a power struggle between Algeria and Morocco. Morocco considers them terrorists, and Algeria backs them. And it's just a very interesting conflict that hasn't really been spoken about outside of like diplomatic circles and stuff. But I just think that's one of the interesting things. One country I've been studying again, Equatorial Guinea. I posted a little bit about it, and that story, they're so sad because like one of the most fucked up dictators there. There was the father. I think his nephew took over, and I think the nephew's son's going to take over. But these guys got so filthy rich, but no one fucked with them because they had so much oil. And not only that, the Chinese funded them, armed them. The Soviets needed them so they could ship weapons through to get to Angola during that war there. And the U.S. just wanted fucking concessions for them. So basically, and the local dictators at the time, like Bokassa and all those guys, and they just were friends with them because they were all like buddies. But the reason why it was so important is people were like, how could a regime like that exist that was so horrific and so fucked up for so long, and no one did anything about it or tried to? Is because every single power benefited from it in some way. But it's just really sad. But not many people know about Equatorial Guinea. It's the only really Spanish-speaking country in the area. And but their Spanish is more like Spaniard Spanish, not like Latin American Spanish. But it's interesting to hear because I've listened to some rappers from there over the years. But no, the story itself it's just really, it's really tragic, And what was it? One of my favorite stories about the guy was Emperor John Bedell Bokassa, Central African Republic, who declared himself emperor, and I think he overthrew the guy who was becoming pro-Chinese, pro-leftist, Daco. So the French overthrew him, and they put their puppet, Bokassa. But Bokassa said, fuck this shit, I'm going to do my own shit. So, but at the same time, he was doing all this horrific shit as like the supreme leader. But then he became best friends with the leader of France at the time. But then Bokassa started doing progressively more fucked up shit. And so when he was out of the way, his former ally in France invaded and put him out, which pissed him off. He's like, you fucking betrayed me. And I think Mobutu gave him safe haven for a while, or one of those guys did, or Idi, because they were all allies. But but it's just interesting seeing all these leaders in Africa, and because a lot of them are well known, Idi Amin and stuff like that, and the other ones are just not as talked about as much. I've seen people say Idi Amin was a great leader, a great African leader. I'm like, this. I mean, if you know the history of him, like, I get at one point he was back in the Arab countries, but another time he was pro-British, pro-Israel. He was more about himself than anything. You know what I mean? And that's what a lot of these leaders, though, they don't really have an ideology. It's about survival. It's about powers. You know what I mean? So. But I just thought that was interesting. Those guys, like the so-called famous, brutal African dictators. Did you hear about?
Yeah. Hey man, it's getting a little bit late.
I know. Yeah.
Maybe we end this at 2 a.m. I think we've been going like 3 hours.
Yeah, that's fine. I didn't realize. I was like, what time is it?
Yeah. And I think, man, we should do this shit again, man. We should do
Definitely.
We should do this like once a month. This is fun.
Yeah, I really look forward to it.
We should both get some alcohol. We should both just like fucking chat like this and go live. And whoever wants to join in the comments, man, this is great.
Yeah, all right.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a good talking to you, brother.
Yeah.
Oh my god. This is
yeah.
the first time I've done this before either. So
it's probably the longest. I don't even know to interrupt you. I'm just taking fucking notes because I got all kinds of books to read now.
Actually, I was thinking I don't like I was gonna put mention a lot more books, but I figured I could just. I think I told you before. It's easier than doing on here if I like send you make a whole list of books, inbox you or something, and you could post.
Maybe. Let's go ahead and end it. Let's go ahead and end it. Let's go ahead and end it, and we'll just have a little discussion. Thanks, comrades, for joining us. We'll probably do this again. Anything else you want to tell the audience before we go ahead and end it?
Not really, but thanks for the opportunity. This is really fun.
All right.